Ethan, you have no idea whose land you just touched. He said it quietly, and no shaking in his voice, and no tears. In just those 9 words. And he go, spoken like a door closing on something enormous, and the men who heard them laughed, and climbed back into their trucks, and drove away through the smoke, still rising, from everything he had spent 40 years building. They thought they had broken an old man, and they had no idea what they had just unlocked. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. And now let's get into it. And the fire started sometime around 2 in the morning. Ethan Walker was already awake when it did. He had been sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, indicing the way he always did when the weather changed, and his left shoulder started reminding him of things that he preferred not to remember. 40-plus years of farming had given him new aches to replace the old ones. And that shoulder was original equipment aced from a night in Albuquerque in 1987 that he had never told anyone in Silver Creek about. He smelled the smoke before he saw the glow through the window. His first thought was lightning. Summer storms rolled through the Montana Valley without much warning, and dry lightning had taken more than one field in the county over the years. But when he pushed open the back door and stepped onto the porch in his boots and undershirt, he realized the sky was clear. Every star was exactly where it was supposed to be. And the smoke was orange-edged and rising in a column that told him this was not nature. This was deliberate. He grabbed his jacket off the hook by the door and walked toward it. And he not ran. Walked. Because Ethan Walker had spent enough of his life running toward fires, literal and otherwise, that somewhere along the way the urgency had burned itself out of him. Initially, what replaced it was something quieter and considerably more dangerous. A kind of absolute stillness that people who knew his history would have recognized immediately, and people who only knew the farmer would have completely misread. And the south field was fully involved by the time he reached the fence line. 43 acres of winter wheat he had planted in September, and nursed through a brutal frost in December, and to come back green and strong through April and May. In 2 months from harvest. Indigo, he had already spoken with the grain elevator in town about storage. He had already done the math on what the yield would mean for the next season's equipment repairs. And all of it was burning. Stood at the fence and watched it, and his face did not change. And what changed was something behind his eyes, a quality of attention that sharpened to a point, and the way it does in people who have spent significant portions of their lives in situations where the wrong reaction gets someone killed. He cataloged what he was seeing with a precision that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with assessment. And the fire had started in at least 3 places simultaneously. And the spacing was deliberate. And someone who knew what they were doing had walked that field and shown their points carefully to ensure maximum coverage and eliminate any possibility of natural explanation. And this was not vandalism. This was a message. He heard the trucks before he saw them. And Sean, 2 of them, and he pulled off onto the county road at the far edge of his property, engines idling. He could see figures leaning against the hoods, 4, maybe 5 men. Young. The orange light from the burning field caught their faces just enough for him to read what was there. And what was there was entertainment. And they were watching the fire the way people watch fireworks. One of them said something Ethan couldn't hear, and the others laughed. Bub. And he walked toward them. again walked, not ran, and the men, because they were reading the situation through the filter of what they believed they were dealing with. And it was an old farmer in worn boots who had just lost his crop and was probably about to cry or beg or threaten to call the sheriff, and did not feel any particular concern as he approached. One of them actually pushed off the hood and stood up straighter. And the way young men do when they want to look like they're doing you a favor by talking to you. Hell of a thing, the man said. It was maybe 30 and thick through the chest. And he wearing a construction company jacket that Ethan didn't recognize. In dry weather this time of year, fires just happen. And that field has irrigation, Ethan said. It doesn't dry out. And the man shrugged. And still, these things happen. Ethan looked at him for a moment. He looked at the others, and taking his time and studying each face with a thoroughness that started to make a few of them uncomfortable without their quite knowing why. He spoke again. His voice was the same as it had always been, unhurried. Inigo, flat, the voice of a man who had learned that volume was for people who weren't sure they were being taken seriously. "And you work for Blake," he said. It wasn't a question. And the man in the construction jacket smiled. "Indeed, mister. And Blake is a businessman. He makes offers on land. And you turned down a generous offer, Mr. Inch Walker. In business, and sometimes that has consequences. And tell him I said no again." The man's smile didn't move. Something shifted behind it. This was a warning. Next time it's not the field. Ethan looked at him for another long moment. He turned and walked back toward the burning field. And it was only when he was most of the way back to the fence that he stopped and turned around. And the 9 words he said carried across the distance tees between them without any effort at all. "And you have no idea whose land you just touched." Any men looked at each other. One of them said something sarcastic. He laughed. The trucks pulled back onto the road and drove away, and Ethan stood alone with his burning field. And the silence that came back in after the sound of the engines faded was very complete. Stood there until the fire burned down enough that he wasn't worried about it jumping the fence line. And he went back inside, and they sat down at the kitchen table and put his hands flat on the wood surface. And for a long time, he just breathed. His wife, Ruth, had sat at the same table for 19 years. Had her morning coffee here every single day, from the morning they moved in until the morning she couldn't get out of bed anymore, which turned out to be 8 months before the end. He had made a promise at this table. And he had made it out loud to her on a Tuesday afternoon in October, when the doctor's news had settled over the house like a season changing. And she had looked at him across the coffee cups and said, and without any particular drama, "I need you to stay." She hadn't meant stay in the house. And she hadn't meant stay in Silver Creek. And stay as the man. He had become the man who fixed fences and grew things and knew everyone's name at the farmer's market and had not in 35 years. And he caused another person a moment's fear. And he had kept that promise. And had kept it through the loneliness of her illness and through the louder loneliness that came after. Through seasons that were bad and neighbors who didn't always treat him fairly and a county government that occasionally made his life harder than it needed to be. He had kept it because the alternative was not just breaking a promise to Ruth, but becoming again something he had worked very hard not to be. But he sat at the table with his hands on the wood, and he thought about 43 acres of winter wheat And he thought about the man in the construction jacket who had used the word consequences like he'd invented it. And he thought about what came next. Because Connor Blake would not stop at one field. Ethan knew men like Blake and had known them his entire life. And they escalated. It was the only mode they understood. The fire was the opening bid. It's not the final offer. And if Ethan met it with silence, the next move would be larger. He thought about this for a long time. And he got up to the window and looked at the diminished glow on the southern horizon where his wheat used to be. "I'm sorry." And Ruth, he said, and he went to the window and to the dark. He tried. He went to bed. He did not sleep. By dawn, he was already back outside. And the thing about Silver Creek was that it was small enough that news moved faster than the people carrying it. And by 7 in the morning, Ethan had 3 neighbors at his fence line and looking at the black expanse where the south field had been. 8. Megan Carter had driven out from town in her diner truck with coffee and food he didn't ask for and wouldn't have thought to ask for. Indy smut. She climbed out and looked at the field and then looked at him. "Ethan." "Morning, Megan." "Happen."
What happened?
"In fire," he said. "Hey," she waited. He didn't add anything. She had known him for 11 years, and she had learned in that time that when Ethan said the minimum, it was because what remained unsaid was very large. And she handed him a coffee and stood beside him and looked at the field. "It wasn't lightning," she said. "And not a question either." "No." "And Blake's people." He glanced at her. "And the deal. What do you know about Blake?" "And run a diner in a small town." "And I know everything." She watched his face. "He's been buying up land east of here for 2 years. Old Hendrick's place and the Sutton parcels and 3 of the farms along Route 9. He wants to run a resort corridor hotels, a casino, the whole thing. And your land is the piece that connects everything. You knew this. Figured you knew too." He had known. Connor Blake had sent a representative to the farm. 6 months ago, a young man in an expensive jacket who had sat across from him at the kitchen table and laid out numbers that were objectively generous. Ethan had listened to the entire pitch without interrupting and then said no. And when the young man asked why, he said something that apparently got reported back in a way that offended Blake's pride. He'd said, "Andy, because I live here." That's not a number. And the young man had smiled tightly and said, "Mr." Blake would be in touch. And this was apparently what being in touch looked like. "I need to talk to someone," Ethan said, and still looking at the field. In SCLU, law enforcement, the sheriff's a decent man. And not the sheriff. He was quiet for a moment. "Old friend." Engine looked at him, and there was something in how he said it, a texture in those 2 words. Any old friend. And that made her feel like she was hearing music played in a key she didn't recognize. "And do you want to use my phone?" "You have a phone." "Just haven't used it in a long time." He turned away from the field finally. "Thank you for the coffee." And she watched him walk back toward the house, and she felt a thing she couldn't entirely name. Not worry, exactly. And something more like the feeling you get when you realize the story you thought you were in is much longer than you understood, and you're only, just now, getting to the part where the history starts mattering. In TC, Connor Blake heard about the fire before 9. He received the call with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose plan is executing on schedule. He had made his assessment of Ethan Walker 3 months ago when the land rejection came back. It had people look into Walker's background and the way he did with any significant land acquisition obstacles. And what they had found was unremarkable. 72-year-old farmer, widow, no children, no significant savings, meaning modest equipment, a mortgage on the property that was small but real, no relatives with resources, no political connections. A man who was, in Blake's estimation, entirely alone. And the fire was the first step, and the isolation would be the second. He had already made calls quietly and carefully, and through layers of business relationships that couldn't be traced back to him directly to the agricultural suppliers in the county, and the lumber yard in Billings that Ethan used for repairs, and the equipment dealer he serviced his tractor through. And nothing explicit, and just the kind of suggestion that carried weight when it came from someone with Blake's economic footprint in the region. And the message was simple. Doing business with Ethan Walker was going to be complicated. He put the phone down and looked out the window of his Billings office at the mountains in the distance and thought about his timeline. Summer was the right season for this to resolve. And by fall, he wanted title to that land, and groundbreaking before the first snow. He had no reason to believe this would not happen. He was a man who had never been wrong about what he could buy or break. Ethan found what he was looking for in the old barn. He hadn't been in there in years. Not since he moved the equipment to the new outbuilding a decade ago, and the old barn had become a place for things that didn't need to be anywhere. In boxes of Ruth's belongings he couldn't bring himself to deal with. Equipment too worn to use and too personal to sell. And in the back corner, under a tarp he had put there himself in 1,891, he came for, pulled the tarp off and stood with it in his hands and looked at what was underneath for a long time before he touched it. The wooden chest was exactly where he left it. And the brass lock was tarnished but solid. He had the key on his keychain still and kept it there through 35 years of not knowing why he was keeping it. The way you keep things that represent a part of yourself that is over, but not entirely gone. And unlocked the chest and lifted the lid. The leather was old, but it had been good leather. The kind that aged into something better than what it started as. And the vest was folded face down, and when he turned it over, the colors were still vivid, the red and white on black, and the lettering that had once been visible from 100 yards away. And he set it on the workbench beside him and looked at it, and he thought about the man who had worn it, and whether that man was still somewhere inside the farmer who had replaced him, or whether he had been thoroughly retired. Put his hand on the leather. And the answer came back immediate and unambiguous. He was still there. He had just been quiet. The calls started coming back in within 6 hours of Ethan going home. Gone through his phone, an old handset that he charged maybe once every 2 weeks and kept in the kitchen drawer, and found the number he hadn't dialed since George W. Bush was in his first term. He had stared at it for a full minute before he pressed call, half expecting the line to be disconnected, half expecting a stranger's voice to answer, and had instead heard the phone ring twice, and then a voice he would have recognized anywhere, in any context, any point in his life. And well, I'll be goddamned. In a D, the voice said. It was deep and rough in a way that suggested it had been deep and rough for a very long time and was not improving with age. And you're either calling to tell me you died, and this is a warning from the other side, indeed, or something actually happened. Annie, something happened. Ethan said, and she, where? And my farm. In Silver Creek. A pause. And how bad? And bad enough that I'm calling you. Another pause. And TP'd longer this time and communicated a great deal. And Lee, give me a number I can reach you. And it's this one. And you've been using this number. Not till today. Okay. Something shifted in the voice, a quality of attention that Ethan recognized, because he was currently putting on the same quality himself. Give me a few hours. Put the phone back in the drawer and went back outside to start of assessing what was left in the south field and whether any of it was salvageable. And while he worked, he did not think about the call. He thought about the work, the way he always had, because the work was the thing that kept the earth under his feet and the horizon in its proper place. The phone rang 4 times that afternoon. He answered it each time and said very little and listened to what was said on the other end. And by the 5th call, he understood that what he had started by picking up the phone was not something he could now put back down. He sat on the porch steps as the sun went low and the shadow of the barn stretched across the yard. And he thought about what Bear had told him in that final call. And the message had gone out. And that was what Bear said. And the message went out. And the response had been well. And Bear had paused in a way that communicated more than words would have. And then he said, "It's brother. You've been quiet so long we thought maybe you'd actually gotten out clean. But you know how it works. A man can leave the road. And the road doesn't leave the man." Ethan looked at the last of the light on the Montana hills. "No," he said quietly, and to himself, inchy, to the evening, into Ruth's memory somewhere in the air around the home they had built together. Guess it doesn't. The next morning, Ingen Carter came back to the farm. And she came because she was worried, and because she was the kind of woman who responded to worry with action, and because she had been up half the night thinking about the texture in Ethan's voice when he said, "old friend," and not being able to categorize it in any file she had for him. And she found him in the equipment shed, and working on the old cedar with a methodical efficiency that suggested he had an actual plan, which was more than she had expected. "You look better," she said. "And I slept. And that's more than I did." Indeed, she sat on an overturned bucket near the door. "Ethan, Blake's got people at the feed store and the lumber yard. And he'd Gatorade, I heard this morning. Nobody's going to sell you anything until he says so. And he's made it clear he's not going to say so." Ethan set down his wrench and looked at her. "No. He's trying to starve you out. No seeds, no materials, and no way to replant or rebuild. And you'll have nothing to do but take whatever he's offering for the land." And she watched his face. "And how are you going to fight that? He's got lawyers and money, and Ethan, he's got the whole county in his pocket, practically. And I've got something he doesn't." "And you're what?" He thought about how to answer that. "In time," he said finally. "And people who keep their word." "Intigay," Megan studied him. "Who called you back last night? And I saw your light on till almost midnight." "Old friend." There it was again. And that same frequency she didn't have a name for. And she opened her mouth to press him on it. And that was when she saw the barn door, the old barn, and the one he never used anymore, standing slightly ajar. And she hadn't noticed it on the way in. And she didn't think she was supposed to notice it now. She said, slowly, "What's in that barn?" "Nothing important. Ike. He said it the same way he said everything else. In that flat, any certain voice. But Megan had been reading people across a diner counter for 22 years, and she knew a man maintaining a story from a man telling the truth. And she got up before he could say anything and walked to the barn. And as she pushed the door open, Inchable walked in and went to the workbench. And the vest was still there where he'd left it. And she looked at it for a long time. And the colors, the lettering, Gus, and the patch on the back that was unmistakable to anyone who had ever seen it in any context. She heard him come in behind her. Ethan Walker. And she said, without turning around, "In 60 years I've been alive. Thought I'd seen most things." And Aiken, Megan. "Hell's Angels." And she said it quietly. "And you were Hell's Angels." He didn't answer. And for how long? A pause. In 14 years. And she turned around then. He was standing near the door, and he had the look of a man who has been keeping something in a locked room for a very long time and had just watched someone walk through the door. Not ashamed, exactly. And more like exposed. And like someone who has been playing one role so completely, and for so long that being seen as a different person, even by someone he trusted. Inske was a kind of vertigo. "Is that who called you?" she said. "Is that who you called?" "And Fee, some of them. And they're coming here." He looked at her. "I didn't ask them to come. He just made a call. And what they do with that is their business. But they're coming." It was quiet for a moment. "I think so." Megan looked at the vest, and he then back at him. "And see, ain't." He thought about what Bear had said, about the response, and about what the message went out meant, and coming from a man who had spent his whole life inside a network that ran on loyalty and reciprocity, and the kind of debt that didn't expire. And he thought about what he had done in 14 years on the road, and how much of it was settling debts like this one, and what the accumulated weight of all of it might look like showing up on a Montana County road after dark. "Enough," he said. Megan sat down on an old hay bale and looked at the floor. "And Connor Blake doesn't know what he started, does he?" "No. He thinks he's dealing with a farmer. Everyone here does." She was quiet for a while. "Were you ever going to tell anyone?" Didn't seem like it needed to be said. "Indigo," Ruth knew. And the change that moved across his face at the sound of her name was small and fast. But Megan caught it. "She knew everything," he said. "And that was the condition. And she would take all of it or none of it. And she said she didn't marry a history. She married a man. But that she wasn't going to be kept in the dark about who that man actually was. A beat. And she was a remarkable woman. And she really was. Megan had known Ruth for the last 4 years of her life. Anderson, what did she think? About all of it. She thought a lot of the men in that world had been failed by a society that didn't make room for them and found their own room the only way they knew how. He paused. And she was usually the smartest person in any given room, including rooms full of people who thought they were smarter than her. "And what does Bear think about you staying out here all these years and not having anything to do with?" She gestured at the vest. "And Bear respects choices. That's actually one of the things that surprised people about that world, if they ever got close enough to understand it. And the code was real. And you could walk away clean if you walked away right. He looked at the vest on the workbench. A walked away right. And now you're walking back. And not back, he said, in a careful precision that felt important. Indigo forward. And just, there's a difference. And I'm not the man who wore that vest. But the men who wore those colored beside me are still my brothers. Meaning that doesn't have a time limit. Megan stood up. And she looked at him for a long moment. And this man she thought she had known and recalibrated something fundamental about her picture of him. And found that the picture in Pichel, while significantly different from what she had held before, it was not wrong. It was just larger. What can I do? She said. And keep running your diner, he said. And keep feeding people. And keep being the thing this town can count on. He paused. And if anyone comes asking about me in the next few weeks, and don't lie. Instinct, but don't offer anything they're not asking for. A can do that. She walked to the barn door and stopped and turned back. Ethan. And for what it's worth. I'm glad you stayed. To Ruth. I'm glad you stayed here and planted things and learned everybody things and showed up with a truck when people needed hauling. And she held his gaze. And whatever you were before, and what you became here was real. You know that, right? He stood with the old barn around him and the morning light coming in through the gaps in the boards and the leather vest on the workbench behind him. And he looked at her with the fullness of everything he was, the farmer and the man behind the farmer, and the years of soil and the singular, deep certainty that the choice he had made at Ruth's kitchen table on that October afternoon was the best choice of his life. He said. Ain't no. Eefty, that afternoon, in his coat. Connor Blake sent 3 men to the key assessor's office to begin the process of filing a zoning complaint against the Walker property. And the complaint was meticulous and largely fabricated. But fabrication didn't matter if you had enough money to make it stick long enough to wear someone down. And Blake had used this approach before. It was less dramatic than fire, but considerably more legally durable. The idea was to create enough bureaucratic friction around the property that the costs of holding it in legal fees, in time, in exhaustion became greater than the cost of selling. He reviewed the filing that evening with his lawyer, a measured man named Hargrove, who had been in Blake's employ for 9 years and who had developed, and over that time, a particular neutrality about the nature of their work that his law school ethics professors would not have admired. And the zoning issue is thin, Hargrove said, and not looking up from the documents. If he challenges it, it's a problem. He won't have the resources to challenge it. And that's the point. He might find someone to help him. Who? The man has no family. And no significant relationships outside this town. And him fully assessed. And Blake moved through the papers. He's isolated. Made some calls yesterday. And Blake looked up. And what calls? We had someone monitor the line. And Hargrove finally looked up. And there was something in his expression that wasn't quite what Blake expected from a measured man. And something more like a flagging concern. He made one call and received several. And to whom? And Hargrove set his pen down. We only got the one outgoing number. We're still working on the incoming. And the outgoing. A cell number registered to a Gerald Morrow. Out of Tucson. And Dilly shrugged. Blake shrugged. Friend. Inspily, old neighbor. Intigo, someone who's going to tell him it's not worth the fight. Possibly. Hargrove picked up his pen again. The name on the cell registration is Gerald Morrow. And the name he goes by, apparently, is Bear. Andy Blake looked at him. And Bear. Yes. Insby, that's a nickname. It is. Andy bleaking into it. And Hargrove made a mark on the document. And I'll have more by morning. Blake looked back down at his papers. He had the Izonic confidence of a man who had never, in 20 years of doing business this way, encountered an obstacle that money and pressure couldn't eventually flatten. A retired farmer with a questionable contact named Bear in Tucson was not changing that record. Fine, he said. Get me the zoning filing signed by morning. And he, outside his window, and somewhere in the direction of Silver Creek. And the evening was settling over the burned south field and the old barn and the kitchen table where a man was sitting in the dark, not drinking the coffee that had gone cold in front of him. And he listening to the silence of the house and thinking about a promise that might be about to cost him a great deal. In Tucson and Denver and Portland and a dozen other cities and highway stops and roadhouses across the American West. And the message was moving man to man, and he phone to phone and road to road. And the answer that was coming back was the same in every place it was asked. And Bing, we're coming. And the burned field did not look better in daylight. It looked like what it was, a deliberate erasure. And 43 acres reduced to black stubble and ash. A not kind of destruction that takes minutes to create and months to recover from, if you recover at all. Ethan walked it at first light, and boots crunching through the char. And he did the kind of accounting that farmers do when damage has to be faced straight. How much was gone? How much remained? And what the path forward looked like if there was one. The numbers were not good. The south field was his primary income crop. Ain without it, and the summer margin was gone. Indigo without the summer margin, and the fall equipment cost became a problem. And without addressing the fall equipment costs, and the spring planting became a question. And Connor Blake understood farming. And that was what Ethan had concluded somewhere around 4 a.m. And the man hadn't just torched a field. Torched the specific field that would hurt the most, at the specific moment in the growing season when losing it was most catastrophic. And he'd done it in a way that looked anyone inclined to believe it. And she, like it could have been an accident, and that wasn't impulsive cruelty. And that was research. And this, which meant Blake had done his homework. And which meant he knew the property's finances and the mortgage balance and the crop insurance limits, which meant he knew exactly how many hits Ethan could absorb before the math stopped working in his favor. Ethan finished his walk at the southern fence line and stood looking at the black field and thought, Angelo, all right. He knows what I have. Indeed, let's see if he knows what I am. He went back to the house and called the county extension office and reported the fire as suspected arson. And the woman who answered was polite and efficient and told him a deputy would be in touch within 48 hours. He thanked her and hung up and gave that process exactly the credit it deserved, in which was not much. Blake had been operating in this county for 2 years. He had not been doing so without building the relationships that made operating easier. Ethan had no reason to believe the sheriff's department would be quick or aggressive about an investigation that embarrassed one of the county's largest current investors. He was making coffee when his phone rang. Not Bear, this time a number he didn't recognize. Mr. and Walker, a woman's voice. Professional, measured. My name is Grace Mitchell. I'm an attorney. I'm calling because a mutual friend suggested you might be in need of some legal counsel. What mutual friend? He goes by Bear. A pause. And he said you'd probably ask. And he said to tell you he still owes you for Flagstaff. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He remembered Flagstaff. Paying $1,994. A situation involving a contract dispute and a county sheriff who had been very confident about how the law applied in his jurisdiction right up until the moment he discovered it didn't. Any Bear doesn't owe me anything. That's what he said you'd say. He also said to tell you that's not how he sees it, and that you should stop arguing and listen. And her tone was warm but precise. They specialize in land rights and property law, and handled cases before developer pressure, manufactured zoning issues, and supply chain interference. And you're already seeing all three. If I had to guess. The seat supplier called yesterday afternoon, he said. And the lumber yard this morning. And that's three, then. Indeed, Mr. Walker, what Blake is doing is not only unethical, and see, parts of it are actionable. Not all of it, he's careful but enough. If we can document it properly and move quickly. And she paused. I'm not going to charge you anything right now. And Bear was very clear that this is a favor owed. You don't need favors. And with respect, Mr. Walker, you need a lawyer. And those are different things. And she let that land. And I can be in Silver Creek by Thursday. He looked out the window at the barn. The morning light on the hills. The long dark scar where the south field was. And Thursday, he said. Meaning, fine. He put the phone down and stood in the kitchen and understood. And the clarity that was part relief and part something harder to name. The thing he had started by making that one call was now larger than a single call. He had reached out to Bear, meaning to ask for advice. And it had come back was a network activating lawyers and contacts. People whose connection to him ran through years in history and a code of loyalty that didn't expire just because decades had passed. And he had been alone in this town for a long time. And he had chosen that. He had worn it like a virtue. He was realizing now that he had been wrong about one thing. And choosing peace had not meant choosing isolation. It had just meant that the connections ran underground and out of sight, waiting. And they were not waiting anymore. And Megan heard about the supply shutdowns through the grapevine. In Silver Creek meant she heard about them within hours of them happening. Indigo, by 9 o'clock, she had confirmed with two separate sources that Pete Danforth at the feed store had received a call from someone in his supply chain that he described, and very carefully, as pressure to be selective about his customer list. Pete was a decent man and a longtime neighbor of Ethan's, and he was embarrassed about it, which was why he'd mentioned it to his wife, and who mentioned it to her sister, who was one of Megan's morning regulars. And by 10 o'clock, she was on her phone, and she called the mayor's office and was told he was in meetings. She called the county agricultural liaison and was told the office was looking into it. Indy coked. She called a reporter she knew at the Billings Gazette, a woman named Sandra Park, who had written about regional land development before and who listened to Megan's summary with the quick and focused attention of someone whose professional interest had just been engaged. And how much of this can be documented? And Sandra asked. Don't know yet. But the fire alone should be a story. Field fire in rural Montana isn't exactly front-page material. Field fire deliberately set by the employees of a major land developer to coerce an elderly farmer into a land sale might be. And Megan said, a pause. Can you prove that? And it, not yet. But I know the man this happened to. There's something to prove. He'll prove it. And who is he? And to be the farmer. His name is Ethan Walker. He's been in Silver Creek for 40 years. She stopped. She thought about the vest on the workbench. And about the flatness in Ethan's voice when he said the word brother, about what she had and hadn't been told, and what she had promised not to offer without being asked. He's well regarded in the community, and she finished. People here know him. Annie, let me look into Blake's operation. Annie, Sandra said. And I've heard his name before in a different context. There's a pattern here. And that makes a better story. Indeed, pattern. There's a pattern. And Megan said, and there's definitely a pattern. And she hung up and looked around the diner, the half-dozen tables occupied at mid-morning, in steady low hum of people who had been coming here for years. And the familiar architecture of a small-town space that held a community's daily life in its walls. He thought about Ethan in that kitchen, alone. Dumb about what it had cost him to make that call. And she picked up the phone again and called Pete Danforth at the feed store. Pete, she said, I know you're in a difficult position. But I need you to write down, and just for yourself, exactly what was said to you and who said it. And don't send it to anyone. And show it to anyone. And just write it down and keep it. A pause. And you do that. And Pete was quiet for a moment. And he go, Megan. And what's going on? I'm not entirely sure yet. Things gone. But I think the more people have their own records of things, and the better. Another pause. Ethan Walker has been your neighbor for 40 years, Pete. A longer silence. I'll write it down, he said. And by the time Wednesday came, Ethan had a clear picture of the damage and a clear picture of the wall Blake had built around him. He seeds not from any supplier within a 100-mile radius. And no lumber, no structural materials, no contractor willing to take the job of repairing the outbuilding that had caught some damage from the fire's heat. His regular equipment mechanic had called awkwardly, and he'd go apologetically, and he'd go with the pained voice of a man being squeezed from both sides, and said he was going to have to hold off on the scheduled tractor service. Ethan had thanked him and meant it. The man had a family and a small business and no framework for dealing with the kind of pressure Blake was capable of applying. Ethan held no ill will toward any of them. He understood the mechanics of what was happening. And Blake wasn't creating enemies in this town. He was creating bystanders. People who weren't willing to actively hurt Ethan, but who could be made to stop actively helping him, which amounted to the same thing when you needed seeds and lumber and a working tractor. What Blake had not accounted for was the informal economy of a rural community, the web of reciprocal labor and borrowed equipment and neighbor-to-neighbor exchange that existed entirely outside the supply chains he was pressuring. And on Tuesday, Ethan's neighbor Roy Hutchins appeared at his fence line with a tractor and a tilling attachment and the simple statement that he had nothing better to do for a couple of hours. In city on Wednesday, and two men from the other side of the county, neither of whom Ethan knew well, and showed up with materials in their trucks and said Megan had called and asked if they could help with some repairs. Ethan stood in the yard looking at them and understood that Megan had been busy. She told us what's happening, and one of the men said, His name was Dale, and he had the build and bearing of someone who had done physical labor his whole life and was not embarrassed by it. Indeed, we've got our own beef with Blake's outfit. He tried to buy my cousin's land last year, and he wasn't as polite about the first offer as he was with you. And what do you mean? Dale looked at him steadily. My cousin ended up in the hospital for a week. In car accident, and they said, might have been. But the timing was interesting. He held Ethan's gaze. And I'm not saying anything officially. I'm saying the timing was interesting. Ethan was quiet for a moment. And was your cousin able to keep his land? And sold it 6 weeks later. Dale set down the materials he was carrying. And I've been waiting for a reason to do something about that. Seems like this might be it. This was how the picture started changing, not through some dramatic declaration, but through the quiet aggregation of small decisions made by people who had their own history with Connor Blake and had been waiting individually, any for a moment when acting felt possible. A woman named Carol from the County Historical Society showed up Thursday morning with records of Blake's property filings going back 2 years. And she spread them on Ethan's kitchen table and pointed to patterns she had noticed that she said struck her as worth a lawyer's attention. An older man named Russell, a retired county clerk, came by in the afternoon and said nothing, and just left a folder of documents on the porch with a note that said, for whatever it's worth. Each of them was doing a small thing. Together, they were building something. Grace Mitchell arrived Thursday at noon in a sensible car that had a lot of miles on it and a back seat stacked with files. And she was 50-something, and with short-neck gray-streaked hair and glasses that she pushed up frequently when she was thinking, and the kind of direct, efficient warmth that made you trust her inside of 5 minutes without entirely knowing why. And she sat at Ethan's kitchen table and went through the documents Carol had brought and the folder Russell had left. And she asked questions that were precise and fast, and that told Ethan she already knew most of the landscape before she arrived. The zoning complaint is thin, she said. Designed to cost you legal fees and time, not to win. Blake knows it won't hold up to a real challenge. He's betting you won't have the resources or the staying power to mount one. Interching, she looked up. He's made that assessment wrong. What about the supply interference? That's actually more useful to us. If we can document that he made direct contact with your suppliers and that those contacts caused them to withdraw services. Indeed, that's tortious interference with business relationships. Not easy to prove, but if people are willing to talk, and some of them will. And she studied him. And you've had a busy few days. And people are motivated. People are usually motivated, she said. And getting them to act on it is the hard part. And she wrote something on her notepad. I need you to be honest with me about one thing. And when Blake's people looked into your background, and what did they find? And the question landed without particular drama, but Ethan recognized its weight. He had been thinking about it himself. And about what a professional background check would reveal, and what it wouldn't, and what was in between. I haven't been in trouble with the law, he said. Never. Not an arrest, not a charge. Nothing. Affiliations. And previous affiliations. 35 years ago. And nothing that intersects with anything illegal. Then or now. And she nodded slowly. He's going to look. He hasn't already. Has already. Probably knows who I called. Ain, does that change your position? Ethan thought about it, honestly. No. Injured, she studied him for a moment longer. Then she closed her notepad and picked up her coffee. And he go, all right. And then here's what we do. They worked at that kitchen table for 3 hours. Ended by the time she left. And there was a plan, not a complete one, and not a guaranteed one. And a point, but a real one. And actual steps and actual leverage points and actual human beings attached to each of them who had specific roles. Ethan walked her to her car and she shook his hand, in which she did with a firmness that felt like a statement rather than a gesture. And Bear said something to me, and she said, pausing at the car door. And he called about this. And this, what did he say? He said, tell him the road remembers, and even when the rider forgets. And she looked at him with an expression that was curious and respectful in equal measure. And I didn't ask what it meant. Figured you'd know. Ethan stood in the yard and watched her drive away. And he did know. It was something he'd said himself years ago in a different context about the way that the people you traveled with carry pieces of you whether you ask them to or not. And he hadn't thought about it in decades. Hearing it come back to him now, pinched secondhand, across 35 years, in the voice of a lawyer in a sensible car, him somewhere between the sternum and the throat in a way he hadn't expected. Stood there until the car was gone and then went inside and sat at the table and put his hands flat on the wood, the same way he had the night of the fire. And this time, what he felt under his palms was not grief or resolution or the weight of a promise being tested. It was something warmer and less alone. And Connor Blake received the news about the attorney on Thursday afternoon and received it badly. He was in a meeting when his assistant knocked, which she only did when something required immediate attention, and when he stepped out and was told that a lawyer named Grace Mitchell had arrived in Silver Creek and was spending 3 hours with Ethan Walker. And he felt the first genuine flicker of annoyance this situation had produced in him. He went back into the meeting and finished it without showing anything, because he was a man who had long practice at not showing things. Afterward, but alone in his office, he called Hargrove. Mitchell, he said. Who is she? Henry Hargrove, who had clearly already run the name, and was ready with the answer. An land rights attorney and based in Tucson. She's been practicing for 22 years. She's won cases against 3 major development companies, Meridian, Insigne Coastline Partners, and Pacific Heights Development, and all in the last 8 years. And she doesn't lose often, and when she does, indeed, she makes the winning side wish they'd settled. And how did Walker get her? In the same way he's getting everything. Same contact this Bear. And he's Gerald Morrow. And Hargrove paused. They have more on Morrow now. And tell me, he's 67 and Tucson resident for the last 20 years. No criminal record. And he owns a motorcycle repair shop and a small property on the edge of the city. Another pause. He was a significant figure in a motorcycle organization. National reach. Any just long-standing membership. Any senior level. And Blake processed this. Hells Angels. And we're not certain of the specific. And come on, Hargrove. Yes, Hargrove said. And he's almost certainly. And Blake was quiet for a moment. He recalculated. And this was what he did when conditions changed, not panic, and not retreat, but recalculate. Walker had a contact with significant organizational reach who was sending him legal representation. In Gaup, that was a complication. Not a fundamental one. In HGU, but a complication. Lawyers could be fought with lawyers. An organizational reach was harder to address directly. It was still fundamentally a peripheral concern. And what mattered was the land and the legal title and the financial pressure. And on all three fronts, Blake still held the stronger position. And else came back on Walker himself, he asked. And a clean record. In the years in Silver Creek, and no incidents. And before that, Hargrove paused in the specific way he paused when he was deciding how to phrase something carefully. Before Silver Creek, his history is less documented. Mid-80s through early 90s, and there are significant gaps. Indeed, the kind of gaps that suggest a lifestyle that didn't intersect much with conventional documentation. And was in the organization. We believe so. Blake rolled this around. A retired biker in his 70s, and with a clean record and a connection to a lawyer and a man who had organizational reach. Annoying. Challenging, real. And still not a fundamental threat to his position. In the zoning filing, he said, is it moving? It's been received and is in the queue. In standard processing. And we accelerate that. A pause. I'll make some calls. And do that. Blake stood and went to the window. Increase the supply pressure. He wanted to be not just the obvious suppliers feed, lumber. He wanted to be the smaller things too. And parts. And services. And whatever he needs to function on that property on a daily basis. And I wanted to require a phone call that doesn't get answered. And that's going to be more visible. And Hargrove said carefully, if the attorney is looking at tortious interference, you know what she's looking for. Be subtle about it. And suggestions, not instructions. No written communications. He paused. And I want someone in town. And not to do anything. And just to watch and report. Understood. And Blake ended the call. He stood at his window for a moment longer. He thought about Ethan Walker in his farmhouse in Silver Creek, and rebuilding with borrowed tools and calling in old favors. And he felt something that was not quite respect, but was adjacent to it in the way that a competent opponent earns a kind of hard-edged acknowledgement. And the old man was not folding. He had expected folding. He had not adjusted his expected outcome. He was simply adjusting his timeline and his methods. He turned away from the window and went back to work. Ethan's tractor stopped working on Saturday. He was running it along the edge of the north field. In the undamaged one, he was already planning next season's rotation around, and when the engine simply stopped. He tried to restart it. Nothing. Go. Climbed down and opened the hood and looked at what was there. And what he saw told a story he had to read twice before he believed it. And fuel line. And partly severed, and not fully. And a kind of precision that made it look like wear, but wasn't. It had failed at exactly the rate you'd expect from something that had been damaged and then allowed to run until the damage completed itself. And clean, deniable, and effective. He stood next to the tractor for a long time. He was not a man who scared easily. He had not been a man who scared easily when he was 25 and running roads that decent people would have avoided. And he was not a man who scared easily now at 72 with ash still in his south field. He felt something standing next to that tractor that he took seriously. Indeed, The recognition that this had been done on his property, in his north field, in the one piece of ground he still had intact, and that whoever had done it had been close enough to do that, and he hadn't known they were there. That was not a comfortable recognition. He pulled out his phone and called Grace. "Tell me about the man Blake has in town," and he said when she answered. A pause. "It makes you think he has someone in town. My fuel line has been cut. And professionally. Undeniable, but professional. And that's not someone coming in from outside and making a move. That's someone who's been watching the property long enough to know when I'm using the tractor and when I'm not." Another pause, longer. "Inigo, how long have you been running that tractor in a regular pattern?" "Every Saturday morning." "And same route." "So they've had at least 2 weeks to observe the pattern." "At least." He could hear her thinking. "Ethan, this changes the security calculus significantly. If he has someone embedded in the community, someone who looks like they belong. And then everything I do is being reported back," he said. "Every meeting I have. Every person who comes to this property. Including my visit. Including yours." He looked out at the open field. "He knows about Grace Mitchell. He knows about the documents Carol brought. He knows about Russell's folder. Angie, does he know about Bear? He's been smart enough to find out who Bear is. He might already know about the others coming." Another pause. "And others," she said, and there was a quality in the word that wasn't quite a question. "He should have told you up front," he said. "And when Bear put the message out, it wasn't just to you. And there are other people I knew, and people who feel they have a debt who are going to want to be here. And that many people." He asked Bear to keep it small. He paused. "He has a different definition of small than I do." "Ethan," her voice was patient and careful. "You need to know what I'm working with here. And DB, what is actually coming." He looked at the disabled tractor. He looked at the black south field in the distance. He thought about the message that Bear had said went out, and the phone calls that had come in, and the way Bear had paused before saying enough, like he was doing mental arithmetic on a number that was not, in fact, small. "We don't know exactly," he admitted. "And seeing, but when those men come to this property again, and Blake's going to send them again, and with or without legal cover, they're going to find it occupied." "Occupied," she said. "Yes." A long silence. "And then, I'm going to need you to promise me something." "And Tina, what?" "Nobody does anything that hands Blake a legitimate grievance. This tips into something that looks like intimidation or threats. And nobody's going to touch anyone," Ethan said. "And that's not what this is." "And then what is it?" He thought about how to answer that. About all the years he had spent learning what the road really taught you, if you were paying attention. Envy, which was not that strength meant force. It meant presence. It meant showing up with enough people around you that the calculation changed, not because anyone was going to do anything, but because everyone could see that something could be done. "It's a reminder," he said, "and that some things cost more than Connor Blake has budgeted." And Grace was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, and her voice had a different quality, still professional, conditioning still measured, indeed, but with something underneath it that might have been the same thing you hear in a person's voice when they realize they're standing closer to a significant moment than they understood. Okay, she said. Then I need to be there when it happens. And I figured you'd say that. When? He looked at his phone. He had 2 new messages from Bear. He hadn't opened them yet. He opened the first one while Grace waited. Said, roads moving. ETA, end of the week. He opened the second one. Said, I told you it wouldn't be small. And shy, sorry about that. And is not really. He looked at the disabled tractor, at the field, at the sky over the Montana hills that was the particular shade of evening blue that Ruth had always loved. End of the week, he said. And he could hear the quality of silence on Grace's end, the specific quality of a person recalibrating something significant. I'll stay. Enough, she said simply. He ended the call and stood in his field, and the weight of what was coming settled around him the way weather settles, not suddenly, not with drama, but completely. He had asked for help, and help was arriving. And somewhere in an office in Billings, a man who had spent 20 years believing that money and leverage were the only things that mattered in any conflict was about to discover that he had started something without fully reading the other side of the ledger. And he and went all the way down. Ethan went inside, sat at the table, and he put his hands on the wood, and he did not feel alone. Somewhere in the dark beyond his windows, and on roads that crossed half the country, engines were running. And they were pointed in his direction. And the week moved strangely after that call with Grace. Ethan fixed the tractor himself, sourced the part from a man 3 counties over who owed him a favor from 2 years back when Ethan had pulled his truck out of a ditch at midnight without being asked, and he went about his days with the particular focused calm of someone who knows something is coming and has made peace with the size of it. He tended what was left of his crops. He met with Grace twice more at the kitchen table, and through documents and filings and the slow machinery of a legal countermove that was methodical and necessary, and that both of them understood was only one part of a larger answer. He did not talk about Bear. He did not talk about end of the week. And he worked, and he waited, and he said nothing to anyone that he didn't need to say. Blake's man in town revealed himself on Tuesday without meaning to. He was sitting in Megan's diner, had been sitting there, turned out, and for the better part of a week, and then nursing coffee and pie and making casual conversation with anyone who came in. Young man in the 30s, and said he was a contractor doing a site assessment for a commercial build east of town. Friendly enough. And the kind of face you stop noticing after the second day. Megan had noticed him precisely because she noticed everyone 22 years behind a counter gives you a taxonomy of strangers. And this one had a quality of attention that wasn't what it claimed to be. He was listening to specifically, and not to everything. It's the way a bored man listens to everything. Into particular things. And she figured it out on Tuesday when she caught him writing something in his phone the moment Dale walked in. In England, Dale had come by to update Ethan on the material situation. Whether Megan knew the specifics of that conversation was not the point. And the point was that the man with the successful story fee put his coffee down, and his phone came out before Dale had even reached the counter. She kept her face neutral and refilled his coffee and said nothing. At that afternoon, she drove to Ethan's farm. There's a man in my diner, she said. Any young guy. He's been there since last Thursday. Ethan looked at her. And Feason, what's he look like? And she described him. Ethan's expression didn't change, but something behind it settled into a different arrangement. In brown jacket, he keeps his phone face down on the table until someone comes in. And you've seen him. He drove past the property twice yesterday. Third time I noticed it, and I wrote the plate down and went to the kitchen counter and picked up a piece of counter and handed it to her. And she looked at the plate number. And give that to Grace, he said. Indignantly, she'll know what to do with it. Megan looked at the number. And she thought about the man's pleasant face and his easy small talk. And she thought about all the things she'd said in the last week in her own diner without knowing it was being heard by someone paid to hear it. Annie, how long have you known he was watching? Since Saturday. The tractor. And you didn't say anything. It was waiting to see if he'd move or just watch. Ethan leaned against the counter. He's just watching. And Blake's too smart to have someone do anything visible in town. He wants information, not incidents. Ending. So everything we've talked about in the last week. Probably in a report on Blake's desk. He said it without heat. That's all right. There's nothing in those conversations that hurts us. And now we know where his eyes are. And Megan sat down at the kitchen table, Ruth's table, and she always thought of it as Ruth's table and put her hands flat on the wood and felt something sharp and cold move through her. Not fear exactly. Like the full weight of what this was landing at full scale for the first time. A man with an office in Billings and a lawyer and a surveillance operative in control of the local supply chain and a history of putting a man in the hospital going after Ethan Walker. And specifically because Ethan Walker had looked him in the eye and said no. He's not going to stop, she said. No. Even when the bikers get here, he's not going to just stop. And no, he's going to adapt. Ethan poured her coffee without asking. And that's what men like Blake do. And they're not stupid. And they adjust. And the arrival changes his calculation. And it doesn't end the fight. And the arrival is just it buys us ground to stand on while the real work gets done. Andrew, the legal work. And the legal work. And the documentation Grace is building. And the testimony from Dale's cousin and from Russell and from whoever else Blake has done this to before he got to me. I sat across from her. And the fire and the tractor and the supply shutdowns, those aren't just things he did to me. And those are a pattern. And patterns can be proven. And she looked at him across the table and said, when did you get this smart? And I was always this smart, he said, with the very small and very dry approximation of a smile that was the most Ethan Walker ever produced. I just don't advertise it. And she laughed. Surprised both of them. And for a brief moment, the kitchen was just two old friends drinking coffee at a table. Which was something they had done dozens of times. And the simplicity of it was a kindness in the middle of everything else. Then her phone rang. And she looked at the screen. It's Sandra Park. And the reporter from the Gazette. Ethan nodded. And shit, take it. Interesting, she answered. Sandra Park's voice was quick and focused and carried the particular energies of a journalist who has found a thread that goes somewhere significant. I've been looking into Blake's acquisition history, and Sandra said without preamble. And I've found 3 prior properties where the pattern is almost identical to what you're describing. And supply pressure, manufactured complaints, an instance of vandalism that was never prosecuted. All three landowners sold within 6 months. E.g., what happened to them after? And two of them are fine and living elsewhere in different situations. In the third one, a man named Carl Trowbridge, outside Missoula, ended up in the hospital before he sold. A pause. Same situation as Dale's cousin. An car accident. Never investigated seriously. Megan looked at Ethan across the table. His face had changed, not dramatically, not any way that most people would have caught, but she caught it. Something behind his eyes went very still and very focused. Can you prove any of this? Megan asked. And not yet. Injured, but I can ask questions. That's what I do. Ethan, Sandra paused. It's a story here, Megan. A real one. You need access to whoever's willing to talk. I'll ask, Megan said. Give me a day. She ended the call and looked at Ethan, and he looked back at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment because the thing Sandra had just said, the hospital, and the car accident, and the pattern had made the shape of Connor Blake very large and very clear and very ugly. He's done this before. With Asian, Megan said. And yes, he hurt people. And yes, and nothing happened to him. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Nothing happened to him yet, he said. And Grace Mitchell met with Carl Trowbridge on Thursday morning. And she drove 4 hours to do it. And she brought a recording device and a notepad and the specific kind of patient determination that comes from 22 years of practicing a kind of law where the wins are not easy and the losses are real. Annie Trowbridge was 64. With a limp that he said the doctors called an incomplete recovery from the accident, but that he called a permanent reminder. He lived in a rented house outside Missoula, and he had, in the 8 months since he sold his land to Blake's company, and developed the particular flatness of a man who has stopped expecting things to go differently. He made Grace coffee and sat across from her at his kitchen table and said, before she could ask her first question, he knew somebody was going to come eventually. He just thought it would be a cop. Are you disappointed it's a lawyer? Considered this. No. Cops haven't done anything for me. And maybe a lawyer's different. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. What do you want to know? And she asked him everything. He told her everything in the measured and careful way of a man who has been over it so many times in his own head that the telling has worn smooth, no longer raw, and just true. Influenced the first offer, and which was reasonable. And the second offer, which was less reasonable but still livable. And the refusals. And the supply pressure. And the bureaucratic complications. And then the Tuesday morning when he was driving his truck on a road he'd driven 600 times. And the steering did what steering doesn't do, and he went into a ditch going 40 miles an hour. And the thing the mechanic told him afterward, engine privately, after the insurance report was filed, and about what the steering column looked like in a way that didn't match the impact. And did you report that? Energy, Grace asked. And reported it. Deputy came out. Integery looked at the truck and wrote it up as an accident. Met her eyes. That was 6 weeks before I sold. Was there pressure in those 6 weeks? Every day, he set his coffee down. And not overt. Nothing you could put in a complaint. It's just the sense that things were going to keep happening. And that the accident was a communication. He paused. I have a grandkid. She was 12 at the time. In Tigoa, I thought about what a second communication might look like. And Grace wrote in her notepad without commenting on that. There were things you heard in this work that you let pass through you because letting them accumulate would make it impossible to keep doing the work, was one of them. And would you be willing to give a deposition? And she asked. He was quiet for a long time. And she let him be quiet. If it meant he can't do it to someone else, he said finally, yes. And she closed her notepad. And she thanked him and drove 4 hours back to Silver Creek with the recording and the notes, the knowledge that this was no longer a case about one farmer and one burned field. And this was a case about a pattern of deliberate criminal behavior that had been hiding under the cover of business practice for years. And she was going to use every tool available to her to make sure that cover came off. And she called Ethan from the road. "We have Trowbridge," she said. "We'll talk." A pause. And she could hear the quality of his silence, which she was starting to learn to read. And this one meant something significant has shifted. "And good," he said. And "how are things at the farm?" "Quiet," he said. But Bear called this morning. And they're 2 hours out. Chawning, Grace gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. Not from fear, from the particular alertness that comes when something you've been preparing for stops being abstract and starts being real. Indily beaters, 2 hours. Give or take. I'm 2.5 out. Drive faster, he said, and hung up. The first sound came just after 10 that night. Ethan was on the porch. He had been on the porch since 8. Not because he was watching for them, but because the evening was the kind of Montana evening that demanded to be sat in the sky doing what it does in that part of the world when the stars come out, which is something that never got ordinary, no matter how many years you lived under it. And Grace was inside with her files. Imogen had come by at 7 with food that nobody was going to eat and had stayed because going home felt wrong, and she didn't know how to explain that, so she didn't try. And the sound started as a texture in the air, not yet distinguishable as a specific thing, just a quality of the quiet changing. Ethan felt it before he heard it clearly, the way you feel weather. And then it became unmistakable, that particular collective rumble. Not one engine, but many engines in the same register. And the sound of a road being used the way it was meant to be used by people who understood it. And Grace came to the screen door. "That?" "And yes," he said. And Megan came to stand beside her. And the 3 of them listened to the sound growing. It came from the east first, and from the north, 2 separate lines of headlights appearing on the county road and converging at the turn that led to Ethan's property. And it was a lot. And more than he had let himself expect. More than small by any definition that lived in the actual world. And they came in pairs and in clusters, and the sound of them together was something you felt in your chest the way you feel certain music. A vibration that was not threatening and not gentle, but simply enormous, the sound of a great number of people moving together with a shared purpose. And Bear was first through the gate. And he was 67 and built like something that had been assembled from harder materials than most people are made of. And with a gray-streaked beard and hands that looked like they had spent their entire existence doing physical work. And he rode up the drive and cut the engine and climbed off his bike and walked to the porch with the particular gait of a man for whom a 400-mile ride is not an event, but simply a Tuesday. He looked at Ethan for a long moment. And he said, And you look like a farmer. Ain, I am a farmer. You look exactly like a farmer. He climbed the porch steps, and the two men held each other in the way that who have been through real things together hold each other, which is not sentimental, but is completely sincere, and is brief, and is enough. And Bear pulled back and looked at him. And you good. Ain't better now. Bear glanced at Grace and Megan. And ladies, back to Ethan. Auntie, walk me through it. And they sat on the porch, the three of them, and Bear, and the ongoing sound of bikes settling throughout the property, engines going quiet one by one, engine voices calling to each other in the dark, a specific organized chaos of a large group of people who know how to move together, arriving somewhere and making themselves known without making themselves a problem. Ethan walked Bear through it from the beginning. The offer, the refusal, and the fire, and the supply shutdowns, and the tractor, and Blake's man in the diner. And Grace gave the legal summary in the precise, impressed way she had, and Bear listened with the absolute attention of someone who has learned that the time for talking is after you understand what you're dealing with. And when they finished, and Bear was quiet for a moment. How many properties has he done this to? He asked Grace. At minimum 3, and possibly more. I'm still looking. And the man whose cousin got hurt. He asked Ethan. Dale. He's been helping with repairs. He's willing to talk. And Trowbridge. And the man in Missoula. He'll give a deposition. Bear nodded slowly. So this isn't really about your field. It never was, Ethan said. And the field was just how I found out what he is. And Bear looked out at his people settling in the bikes, and the men and women who had ridden through the night to be here, and some of whom Ethan knew, and some of whom were a generation younger and knew him only as a name, as a story, as the reason Bear had sent a message and said someone needs us, and not a single one of them had said anything but yes. And he watched them for a moment with an expression that was complex enough that Ethan didn't try to read all of it. And you know what I told the younger ones? In a sing, Bear said. And the ones who don't know you. No. And it told them. There's a man in Montana who spent 14 years on the road, and in that time he personally intervened in 6 situations that would have ended badly and didn't because he was there. He told them he walked into a room in Phoenix in '93, where 2 chapters were about to do something that would have destroyed both of them, and he talked for 4 hours straight, and nobody left that room in pieces. And Bear paused. And I told them he walked away clean to take care of his wife, which is the most stand-up thing I ever saw a man do, and that he has been quiet for 35 years and never asked us for a single thing. And he's asking now. He looked at Ethan. And there was not one no. And not one. Ethan looked at the yard full of people who had crossed state lines in the dark to stand beside him, and something moved through him that he was not going to name out loud, indeed, but that Megan Angle, watching his face, and recognized as grief and gratitude arriving simultaneously, which is one of the more complicated combinations a human being can experience. Didn't want it to be this many, Ethan said. No, Bear almost smiled. And that's why I didn't ask you how many. Blake's phone rang at 11:15. And the voice on the other end was his operative, the contractor. And then the man in the diner, and the voice was different from how it had been in previous calls. Indeed, there was a quality in it that Blake initially could not identify, and then identified as something he hadn't heard from this particular man before. Uncertainty. And there are bikes at the Walker farm. Indians, the man said. Andy Blake set down his drink. And how Annie? He drove past twice. And I stopped counting at 40. A silence. Embersyke, he motorcycles. At least, and probably more. And I couldn't see the whole property. Another pause. And Mr. Blake, these are, and the patches. And these aren't a local club. And T on these are. And I understand. And Blake said. And there are out-of-state plates. Arizona, Colorado, a Washington plate. And these people came from, and understand, Blake said again. He ended the call. He sat in his house in Billings for a long time without doing anything, which was not something he was accustomed to. He thought about what 40 motorcycles meant, and what the people riding them meant, and what the fact that they had crossed multiple state lines in a single evening meant about the nature of the connect between those people and the old farmer whose field he had burned. And he thought about Hargrove's report, about the gaps in Ethan Walker's documented history, and about the name Bear and the Tucson phone number and the lawyer from Tucson who had 22 years of taking development companies apart. And he thought about the 3 prior properties and the pattern he had built his confidence on, and about how different those situations had been from this one. The previous landowners had been, in each case, in a genuinely isolated. See, no network, no resources, and no organizational connection to anything outside the immediate county. And that was how he chose his targets. It was the fundamental selection criterion. Isolated people, when pressed effectively, eventually sold. Ethan Walker had presented as isolated. Ethan Walker was not isolated. And Blake was not a man who panicked. He was not a man who retreated at the first sign of complication. But he was, at his core, a man who survived in the business world by accurately assessing situations. And he was sitting in his house, assessing this one with a cold precision that was stripping away the comfortable certainties he had brought to it. Called Hargrove at 11:30. He'd need to know, he said without preamble, if there's any legal exposure from the Trowbridge situation. A silence that was longer than Hargrove's silences usually were. It depends on what comes out and what form it takes. Walker's lawyer was in Missoula today. And the silence that followed this was even longer. How do you know that? And I've had someone watching the farm. And she left early Thursday, and 20 drove north. And she came back late. I had someone run the timeline against Missoula. That's Hargrove stopped. If she talked to Trowbridge, and assume she did. Another pause. Connor. And the Trowbridge situation is not clean. And the mechanic who looked at the truck afterward was paid to file a specific report and not file a different one. If Mitchell has Trowbridge talking and she finds the mechanic, and the mechanic be convinced to stay quiet. A very long silence. Ingergull, I'm a lawyer, and Hargrove said, I'm not going to answer that question. Inshidi, hypothetically. Inshidu, hypothetically. A man who was paid once can be paid again. But a man who is talking to a plaintiff's attorney because he feels guilty about something has motivations that money doesn't necessarily address. And Hargrove paused. I need to ask you directly, is there anything else beyond Trowbridge and beyond Walker anything that, if it came out in the context of this case, would be significant. Andy Blake thought about this honestly. The honest answer was that there were several things, and spread across several years of doing business in a way that was effective, precisely because it never broke laws cleanly. It bent them and pressured them, operated in the spaces between them. And none of it was easily provable. But easily provable and provable were not the same thing. And a motivated attorney with a motivated client and a reporter asking questions was a combination that had a way of finding things that were not supposed to be found. "I need options," he said. "And your best option right now," Hargrove said carefully, "is to stop. Stop the supply pressure. And stop the zoning filing. And stop everything. And back completely and let the situation cool. Costs you the timeline, but it reduces the exposure. And the land. The land can wait." Blake was quiet for a long time. "And then, get me a meeting with Walker. And not through intermediaries. Me, him, and a lawyer each. In neutral location." And Hargrove's voice was cautious. "And you want to negotiate. And I want to understand what it takes to make this go away. You might not be interested in making it go away. Everyone is interested in making something go away." "So," Blake said. "And the question is what you offer." He paused. And Peace set up the meeting and ended the call and sat in the dark of his house and thought about 40 motorcycles on a county road in Montana, and about an old farmer who had looked at his men and said 9 words that contained no fear at all. And he thought about the miscalculation, the specific, in fundamental miscalculation of reading a man's quietness as weakness. And the old farmer had not been weak. He had been patient. And Connor Blake, AD, for the first time in 20 years of doing this work, and felt the specific cold clarity of a man who has pushed something too hard and hurt, pain under his hands, and the structure beginning to push back. And then on the porch, and after Bear went to sleep in the spare room, and Grace went back to her files, and Megan finally drove home, Ethan sat alone in the quiet and listened to the sounds of people settled across his property, the occasional low voice, and the shift of someone moving in the dark, and the simple, unmistakable sound of a space that had been empty for a long time becoming full. Phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. He answered. "Mr. and Walker." The voice was smooth and controlled and gave away nothing. He recognized it anyway, in the representative who had sat at his kitchen table 6 months ago, the same company, and the same register of professional remove. "The name is Connor Blake. I think it's time we talked directly." Ethan looked at the dark fields, at the north field that was still green and whole, and at the black scar in the south that was already, slowly at its edges, beginning to show the smallest suggestion of what would eventually return. "All right," he said. "Hey, talk. And I'd like to meet. And to discuss the situation. Face to face, like businessmen." "I'm not a businessman," Ethan said. "I'm a farmer." And then, like two men who have a problem to solve. And a pause. And she went. And she, Saturday. In neutral ground. "I'll come to Silver Creek if that makes it easier." Ethan thought about this. And about what Blake wanted from a meeting, and what he was willing to offer, and what had happened in the last 12 hours to make a man who had been running a full-scale pressure campaign suddenly want to sit down and talk. He thought about Trowbridge. about Grace's drive to Missoula. Indeed, about 40 motorcycles and a pattern that was becoming visible in the light. And Saturday, he said, in Megan's diner. It's 10 o'clock. And that's a public location. Yes, Ethan said. It is. A beat. And fine. Inshin Saturday. Ended the call and sat with the phone in his hand and looked at the night around his farm, and the land he had worked for 40 years, and the land where Ruth had planted her garden, and where the first frost always came a week earlier than the forecast said it would, and where the south field, even now, even burned, and was already in the earliest stages of beginning to come back. And a meeting with Connor Blake on Saturday. He had 40 brothers on his property tonight. He had a lawyer with a deposition from a man in Missoula and a reporter from the Gazette asking questions Blake didn't want asked, and a retired county clerk who had left a folder on his porch, and a neighbor who had shown up with a tractor because 40 years of being a decent person in a community turned out to be exactly what it looked like, a form of wealth that couldn't be bought or burned. He sat on the porch until the night was very quiet and the stars were doing what they always did. And he breathed the air of his own land. And he thought about Ruth. And he thought about the promise he had kept. And he thought about what she would say if she could see Saturday coming. Thought she would say, "See, a good man never truly walks alone." Put his phone in his pocket and went inside. He slept well for the first time since the fire. Bear was already up when Ethan came downstairs Friday morning. He's sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee he'd made himself, which meant he'd found the coffee in the filters and figured out the machine without waking anyone, which was a skill specific to men who had spent decades moving through unfamiliar spaces quietly. He looked up when Ethan came in and said nothing. Ethan just poured a second mug and pushed it across the table. And they sat like that for a while. And the morning coming in through the window. And the sound of the property outside somebody moving. A low voice. The particular settled quality of a space that had absorbed a large number of people overnight and was holding them. How many stayed? Ethan asked. Instead, 41. And 6 had to head back jobs, families. Rest said they're not going anywhere until Saturday at least. And Bear wrapped both hands around his mug. And Keese, couple of the younger ones already fixed that fence section on the east side. And the one that was leaning. I've been meaning to get to that fence for 2 months. And now you don't have to. Inspix. Bear looked at him. Blake called you. It wasn't a question. Ethan had told him last night before going in. And Saturday. And the diner. And what does he want? And to find out how much this cost him to make stop. And Bear was quiet for a moment. And what's your number? I don't have a number. The land isn't for sale. And that's not what I mean. And Bear set his mug down. What does it cost him? Not money. And does it cost him to actually fix what he's done? Ethan looked at his coffee. This was the thing he had been sitting with since the call. The distinction between what Blake wanted from Saturday, which was an exit from a situation that had become costly, and what Saturday could actually produce if handled correctly. And Blake wanted a transaction. A number, a handshake, a story that ended cleanly. And Ethan wanted was different in kind, and not just degree. In Trowbridge, he said. And Dale's cousin. Every person he's run this play on need to be part of whatever comes out of Saturday. And Bear looked at him steadily. He's not going to hand you that. He doesn't have to hand it to me. Grace is building that case whether Blake agrees to anything on Saturday or not. Saturday is just, it's a chance to see what kind of man he actually is under pressure. And whether there's something in him that recognizes what he's done. A pause. I don't expect there is. But I've been wrong before. And if there isn't, and we finish what Grace started, and we take it through the legal system, and it takes longer, and it's harder, and it gets to the same place. He met Bear's eyes. He's not walking away from this, Bear. And that's already decided. And the only question is whether he walks away standing up or being carried. And Bear was quiet for a long time. The morning moved outside. And someone laughed a real laugh. And he's sudden and easy. Insta laugh. The laugh of someone who was comfortable where they were. And Bear looked toward the window, and something crossed his face that was private enough that Ethan didn't try to read it. And I'll stay for Saturday and see you, Bear said. I know. And if he shows up with anything other than lawyers, and he won't. He's not that kind of stupid. Every kind of man has their version of that kind of stupid. They're scared enough. He's not scared yet, Ethan said. And worried. Recalculating. He's not scared. He drank his coffee. Saturday might scare him. And the Bear almost smiled. And good. And Grace arrived at 9 Friday morning with Sandra Park, missing, which was a development Ethan had not been told about in advance. And Sandra was 40-something, and with the specific brand of alert stillness that belongs to journalists who are good at their jobs, the kind of person who could sit in a room and be almost invisible and come away knowing everything that happened. And she shook Ethan's hand and said, before he could say anything about whether this was a good idea, you didn't agree to this. And Grace called me this morning. I'm here because what I found about Blake's acquisition history is directly relevant to your legal situation, and it's faster for me to tell you in person. Ethan looked at Grace. And Grace looked back at him with the expression of someone who has made a calculated decision and is prepared to defend it. And she found something, and Grace said, and should hear it. And they sat at the kitchen table, Ethan, the four of them, Ethan, and Grace, Sandra, and Bear, who had no official role in any of this, and sat at the end of the table with his coffee and said nothing and heard everything. And Sandra opened her notebook and laid it flat. And Blake's company, Cascade Development, has completed 14 major acquisitions in Montana, in Wyoming, and Idaho over the last 8 years. They've been able to document the acquisition process in 9 of them. In 7 of those 9, and there is a pattern of pre-acquisition pressure that matches what happened here. In supply interference, in bureaucratic complications, at least one incident of property damage. Inchman, she looked up. In 4 of those 7, and the landowner required medical attention at some point during the acquisition process. Accidents, but in the official record, every one of them. The table was very quiet. And 4 people, Ethan said, that I can document. And maybe more. Instantly, Sandra looked at her notebook. And Trowbridge is the most recent and the most clearly connected. And the earliest one, a family farm outside Sheridan. In Wyoming, 2017, the husband died. And she, heart attack, an official record. He was 58 and had no prior cardiac history. And nobody said anything. And Bear looked at his coffee and then looked at the window. And his jaw was doing something specific that Ethan recognized from 25 years ago as the expression Bear produced when he was keeping very tight control over a very strong reaction. Can you prove any of the four? Grace asked. Not to a criminal standard. Not yet. In the loss, but I can ask questions in public print that make investigators look at it differently. And Sandra kept her eyes on Grace. If you file a civil case that goes to discovery, and my story runs while discovery is happening, and the two things reinforce each other in ways that make it significantly harder for Blake to manage. You're suggesting coordinating the legal and media timing. I'm suggesting that the truth comes out in whatever order produces the most complete picture. And Sandra closed her notebook. I'm not doing this for drama. There's a man in Missoula with a permanent limp and a family in Wyoming that lost a husband. And Connor Blake has been doing business like it's fine for 8 years because nobody has put the full picture together. Ethan looked at the table surface. Ruth's table. He thought about the family in Sheridan, Pensacola, Wyoming, the wife, and whatever kids there were. And the farm that were probably a Cascade development property now, converted into something Blake could monetize. He thought about 58 years old with no cardiac history and an official record that said heart attack. He thought about the man in the construction jacket who had said consequences like he'd invented the word. And he looked up. His expression had the quality of something that had finished being decided. And what do you need from me? But on record statement about what happened here. And Sandra said, in your account, in your words, in the record. And you can have it. And anything else you're willing to give me. And background. And sheer context. And the fuller picture of who you are and why Blake misjudged you. She held his gaze. And I think the fuller picture matters. I think it changes the story from developer pressures farmer to something that has more weight. Ethan looked at her and understood what she was asking about or approaching, and just without saying it directly. The vest. History. And the 14 years that sat between the man he had been and the man this town knew. He thought about what it would mean to make that public, and how it would land, and what it would cost, and whether the cost was the right cost for the moment. And let me think about that part, he said. Fair, Sandra said. Friday afternoon produced two things that changed the shape of Saturday significantly. And the first was a call to Grace from Hargrove, not Blake's call. Hargrove's. A personal and careful, and with a quality in his voice that Grace described to Ethan afterward as a man testing whether there's still a door he could walk through before the building falls on him. Hargrove had asked, without quite asking directly, whether there was a framework in which the civil exposure could be contained, whether Ethan was interested in a settlement that would include the legal costs and damages from the fire and the supply interference, and structured in a way that didn't require full public disclosure. Grace had said she would convey the question and respond on Monday. He's worried. Grace told Ethan. And then Hargrove specifically, and not just Blake. A lawyer in that position who makes that call on a Friday afternoon is worried about his own exposure, and not just his clients. And Hargrove be reached. And separately, Ace looked at him with careful attention. He's been Blake's lawyer for 9 years, but a lawyer whose client has potentially crossed lines that implicate the lawyer that's a specific situation. And she paused. If Hargrove has known about the pattern, if he's helped structure the pressure campaigns in ways that could be characterized as facilitating tortious interference, or worse, his exposure depends on what comes out and when. So his interest and Blake's interest might not be identical. They're definitely not identical, and Grace said. And they've been aligned as long as the situation was manageable. This situation is no longer clearly manageable. Ethan thought about this. And let Saturday play out. And we'll see where Hargrove lands. And the second thing was Dale, and who arrived Friday afternoon with a man Ethan didn't know 50s. And quiet, with the kind of face that had been through something and come out the other side of it without pretending it hadn't happened. And Dale introduced him as Kevin. And it didn't give a last name. Said Kevin had something to say. And they sat on the porch. And Kevin turned his hat in his hands for a moment before he spoke. I worked for Cascade Development, he said. And logistics. And been with them 4 years. He looked at Ethan without flinching. And drove one of the trucks the night they burned your field. The porch was completely silent. I'm not here to explain it. Kevin said. There's no explanation that works. I needed the job, and I told myself a lot of things. That's what you do. He put his hat on his knee. But when I heard about the Missoula situation and about Trowbridge, I stopped. I didn't know about that when I was hired. I need you to understand that. What I was told was property dispute, intimidation, and nobody gets hurt. And when I found out someone had gotten hurt, he stopped again. We have kids. Ethan looked at him for a long time. And were you willing to do? I testify to what I saw and what I was asked to do. I'll give you names the 2 men who actually set the fire and who gave the order, how far up it went. Met Ethan's eyes. Went straight to Blake. Not a rumor and not an inference. A direct instruction. He was in the room when he gave it. And Grace had come to the porch door. And she was very still. Until you give that in a sworn statement, she asked. Yes. And Joe, on record, with your full name. Yes. Ethan looked at him. And they can, Kevin. Why are you doing this, and not the version you already gave me? And the actual reason. And Kevin was quiet for a long moment. My oldest daughter is 14. And last week, she asked me what I do for work. I told her logistics. And she asked what that meant. Started explaining, and about 45 seconds in, I stopped because I couldn't. He looked at his hands. Couldn't finish the sentence. And I couldn't finish explaining my own job to my 14-year-old daughter. He looked up. That's the actual reason. Ethan was quiet for a moment. And then, all right. He looked at Grace. Grace looked at him. And Nietzsche, between them, in the silence, in the shape of Saturday, shifted again, not just a meeting between 2 men with a dispute, but the opening of something larger. In the first moment, when full weight of what Blake had done and what it was going to cost him, he became unavoidable. Saturday morning came cold and clear, in which was the mountains making a point. And Bear was up before Ethan again. And they made coffee again. And they sat at the table again. And this time the silence was different. It had the quality of a silence before something, and the kind you don't fill, because filling it would be disrespectful to what's about to happen. At 8:30, Ethan's phone buzzed. A text from Blake's number, 80, still on for 10. He showed it to Bear without comment. And Bear read it and set the phone down. And you know what he's coming to do. Yes, coming to buy his way out. Find out the price of making the rest of it go away before it gets worse. And yes, and you're going to tell him there isn't a price. Ethan picked up his coffee. And I'm going to let him tell me what he thinks the situation is. And then I'm going to let him find out what it actually is. And Bear looked at him for a long moment. And you're going to enjoy this a little. No, Ethan said. And then, honestly, maybe a small amount. Indeed, they drove into town at 9:30. Ethan in his truck, and Grace in her car, Bear riding alongside, despite Ethan telling him he didn't need to. Indigo, Bear had responded to this by starting his bike, which was all the response it apparently required. Hagen had the diner set up with a specific table in the back, private enough for a real conversation, in the public enough that anyone inclined to do something inadvisable would have to think twice about it. And she had coffee ready, and a look on her face that communicated a very precise combination of determination and apprehension that she was not going to mention to anyone. And she pulled Ethan aside when he came in. And Sandra's outside. Ange, she's not coming in. You didn't ask her to be here. And she's just here. In case. In case of what? In case of whatever needs witnessing. And Megan straightened his collar, which didn't need straightening, in the unconscious way of someone doing a small physical thing, because the emotional thing is too large. And you okay? Hey, I'm fine. You need look fine. That's what worries me. And she studied his face. Ethan, and see whatever he offers. Hey, no, don't let him off easy because you're tired of fighting. And you haven't been fighting that long. He's been hurting people for 8 years. He looked at her. Hey, no, Megan. She stepped back. And okay. She went back behind the counter and started doing something with the coffee maker that it didn't need done. Blake arrived at 10 on the dot, which was the punctuality of a man who believes that arriving exactly on time signals control of the situation. He was 55, and well-dressed in a way that was calibrated to read as casual, but wasn't, and with the physical confidence of someone who had been powerful long enough that it had become structural and built in to the way he moved through space. He had Hargrove with him, who was a thin man with careful eyes and the expression of someone doing continuous risk calculation. Blake looked around the diner. Eyes landed on Bear, who was sitting at the counter with his coffee and his gray-streaked beard and his 40 years of road on him like a weather system. And something in Blake's face recalibrated in a way he didn't mean to show but did. And he walked to the back table, sat down across from Ethan, and Hargrove sat beside him. And Grace sat beside Ethan. Blake looked at Ethan for a moment, and he said, I owe you an apology. Ethan said nothing. What happened to your field was not an instruction I gave in the way it was carried out. There were people acting on their interpretation of a broader directive, and they exceeded. Stop, Ethan said. And Blake stopped. And don't do that, Ethan said. Zont. His voice was exactly what it always was. And flat. And hurried. Completely certain of itself. And sit down at this table and tell me your people misunderstood you. Indicating, I have a witness who was in the room when you gave the specific instruction. And I have a sworn statement. And so do not sit here and tell me about broader directives. The color that moved through Blake's face was not quite anything Ethan had a clean name for. It was the color of a man encountering something he had been told couldn't exist, a specific piece of information that should not available, and having to absorb it in real time across a diner table. And Hargrove went very still beside him. Blake looked at Hargrove. The look was brief, but it communicated a complete conversation, the specific, silent exchange of two men realizing simultaneously that the terrain under them has changed in a fundamental way. Andy Hargrove did not look back at him. He looked at Grace. Mrs. Mitchell, Hargrove said carefully. And what exactly is the scope of the witness statement? In direct observation of Mr. and Blake giving the instruction to proceed with the property damage at the Walker farm. And Grace said, first person, and record, sworn, and available for deposition. She opened the folder in front of her. And we also have documented statements from two of the men who carried out the action, corroborating the chain of instruction. Interesting. She looked up. And we have Carl Trowbridge in Missoula, and the mechanic who filed the accident report and who has decided, indeed on reflection, and that what he filed was not entirely accurate. And the silence at that table was the specific silence of a moment that has become irreversible. Blake looked at Ethan. And something had changed in his face, not broken, not collapsed, but stripped. The professional architecture of controlled confidence that he walked in with had lost some essential structural element, and what was underneath it was more human and less comfortable to look at. And what do you want? Anne, Blake said. And then just that, indirect and flat, and stripped of the negotiating warmth he had walked in with. They want several things, Ethan said. And none of them are negotiable. Everything is. And these aren't. Ethan leaned forward slightly. And she first. And you're going to fully compensate the loss of my Southfield replacement value, plus the income I would have generated this season. And Grace has the number. Didn't wait for a response. In a second. And Carl Trowbridge. You're going to compensate him for his land at the current development value, not what you paid him under duress, and what it's worth now and today, with your resort corridor plans factored in. And you're going to cover his medical costs ongoing, because he is still recovering from what your people did to his truck. He held Blake's eyes. Third, every other property you acquired through this pattern, and my lawyer is going to identify every one of them. You are going to open your acquisition records and allow independent review of whether the sale was coerced. Blake's jaw had tightened. And you're describing. I'm describing the minimum, Ethan said. And the alternative is that Grace files next week. And Sandra Park's story runs in the Gazette and gets picked up by the wire services because she's already placed it. And you spend the next several years in discovery, explaining to a jury why 4 people in 3 states had accidents while you were trying to buy their land, including one man who died. He paused. I'm giving you a way to do this that doesn't end with you in a criminal proceeding. That's not mercy. That's practicality. You want the people you hurt made whole. And I don't actually need your conviction to accomplish that. And the diner was very quiet. Megan was not pretending to do anything behind the counter. And she was just standing there and to be listening. Go. And Hargrove spoke first, which itself was a signal. Mr. Dean. Walker, I'd like to request a recess to confer with my client. And you can have 10 minutes. Indeed, Grace said. Ethan stood and went to the counter and sat beside Bear, and Megan refilled his coffee. and no one said anything. Indy Bear looked straight ahead. Ethan looked straight ahead. Infring from across the room, he could hear the low, stringent sound of Hargrove talking to Blake in the back booth, not the words, and just the register, in the texture of a lawyer telling a client something the client did not want to hear. After 7 minutes, Hargrove came to the counter alone. "Mr. Walker," he said, "could I speak with you privately for one moment?" Ethan looked at him. "And Fionn, just a moment." And Hargrove said. They stepped to the side, and near the door. And Hargrove kept his voice very low. He had the look of a man making a decision that was going to cost him something, but had become unavoidable. "There are things I know that are not in your lawyer's file yet," he said, "about the full scope of the acquisition pattern, about the Wyoming situation specifically." He met Ethan's eyes directly. "And if I provide a full accounting voluntarily and with specificity, I would need to know that is recognized as cooperation." Ethan studied him. "And are you asking me to help you?" "I'm asking whether cooperation is structurally possible." "And that's Grace's conversation," Ethan said. "Not mine." He paused. "But I'll tell you what I told your client. I'm interested in every person who was hurt being made whole. It's the goal. That now, how we get there can take different forms." Hargrove nodded once, and very precisely. Went back to the table. Ethan went back to the counter and sat down. And Bear looked at him without moving his head. Hargrove's turning. And he was always going to, Ethan said quietly. "The man who spent 9 years helping build something like this eventually gets to the point where getting out of it has to be worth something." And he just gave him a door. "And Blake." Ethan picked his up coffee. "And this Blake's in there right now being told by his lawyer that the lawyer is going to look out for himself, and that the math has changed, and that the choice is control what comes out, or have it come out in whatever order and form the other side decides." He looked at the coffee. "And that's a hard conversation to be in. And do you care?" Ethan thought about it, honestly. And about Trowbridge and his limp, and the mechanic who'd filed a false report, and the family in Wyoming, and the kids who'd grown up without their father. And about the construction jacket, and the word consequences, and 43 acres of winter wheat at 2 a.m. About how long Blake had been doing this. And about how many doors no one had ever put in front of him before now. "No," he said. "And I don't particularly." Hargrove came back to the counter. "Mr. Indeed, Blake would like to continue the conversation. He is prepared to discuss the framework you've described." Ethan set down his coffee and stood up. Bear put a hand briefly on his arm, not stopping him. "Inigo, just the weight of a hand, and the specific communication of, 'I'm here.'" Ethan looked at him and nodded once and walked back to the table. Blake was sitting differently than he had been. The structural confidence was gone entirely now, and what was left was a man in a diner booth in a small Montana town who had spent 20 years believing that money insulated him from consequence, and who was sitting across from the specific evidence that it did not. He looked at Ethan with the eyes of a man who has had something stripped from him and is still in the process of understanding what it was. "Insco, I'll sign the agreement," Blake said. "In your terms, the compensation for Walker and Trowbridge, the independent review of prior acquisitions." He paused. "You need the Gazette story held pending the signing." Sandra Park makes her own decisions, Ethan said. I'm not her editor. And you can tell her we reached an agreement that is currently being formalized and that the details are forthcoming. And what she does with that is her business. Ethan held his gaze. Any gain, but I'll tell you this. Any Sandra Park is going to write whatever story the facts produce. And the agreement doesn't change the facts. What changes is whether the facts include a man who finally did the right thing or a man who had to be dragged there every step of the way. He paused. Andy, which story do you want her to write? Blake was quiet for a long time. Outside, through the diner windows, Blake's eye caught something, or rather caught the absence of something. And the thing that hadn't been there when he walked in, but was absolutely there now. Because Bear had moved from the counter to just outside the door, and he was not alone. And the people with him were not loud or threatening or doing anything that could be characterized as anything other than standing in a public space on a Saturday morning. But there were a lot of them. And the patches on their vests were clearly visible. And the simple, incomplete, utterly silent statement of their presence was the same statement it had been all week, and the same statement that Ethan had made in 9 words the night his field burned. And you have no idea what you touched. And Blake looked at them. And then he looked at Ethan. Tell me where to sign, he said. Grace worked at Megan's back table for 3 hours while Hargrove made calls. Sandra Park came inside finally and sat at the counter, and Megan fed her and didn't ask questions. And Bear came back inside and found a corner and didn't say anything to anyone. Indeed, the diner filled up by noon. It was a Saturday. It always filled up by noon. And the ordinary business of Silver Creek went on around the extraordinary business happening at the back table, which was the specific beauty of a small town. And the ordinary and the enormous could occupy the same space at the same time, and somehow neither canceled the other. At 2:15, Blake signed the preliminary agreement. He signed it with the pen Grace handed him, and he did it without theater, and without additional words, and with the specific economy of a man who has lost something and is not going to make it worse by pretending otherwise. Hargrove signed beside him. And Grace signed on behalf of Ethan. Ethan signed for himself. Indeed, Blake stood up to leave. He looked at Ethan one more time. "I want to say something," he said. Ethan waited. "And I've been doing business this way for a long time. And I've known for a long time that it was." He stopped. Indy started again. And I told myself it was business. And that the people on the other side of these transactions were just obstacles. Easy positions. And that the personal cost to them was not my accounting. He looked at the table between them. And not at Ethan. He knew about Trowbridge. What happened to him? And I told myself he would have been fine if he stopped. And that's not a sentence that finishes in a way that makes me anything but what I am. He looked up. "I'm sorry." And the words sat on the table between them. Ethan looked at it for a moment. The word, the man, the 8 years of damage the word was trying to cover, and he let it sit there without rushing to do anything with it. And because some apologies need a moment before you respond to them, and some don't need a response at all. And sorting out which kind this was required a honesty that the moment itself demanded. "I hear you," Ethan said finally. Not, "I forgive you." Not, "It's all right." And just, "I hear you." Which was true and complete and gave back nothing that wasn't his to give. And Blake nodded once. He and Hargrove walked out. through the window. Ethan watched them get into their car. He watched them drive down the main street of Silver Creek and in turn disappear. And he thought about Trowbridge in Missoula getting a call next week, about the family in Wyoming, and whatever review of that situation would eventually produce. About the work that was still ahead, the independent review, the depositions, and the slow, careful documentation that would take months, and that Grace would lead with particular patient thoroughness that was apparently just who she was. He thought about Ruth, thinking about what she would make of this Saturday, the diner, the table, and Blake's face at the moment of signing, and the word sorry landing in the space between two men who had no reason to trust each other and every reason to understand each other exactly. And she would have opinions. And she always had opinions. And she would have said something precise and intelligent and probably slightly wry about the nature of men who only discover accountability when the cost of avoiding it exceeds the cost of embracing it. And she would have been right. And she usually was. And Gigan appeared beside him and put a cup of coffee on the table and sat down. And did it work? She said. Started, he said. Working is what comes after. Angie, she looked at the table. What comes after? A lot of paperwork, he said. Then, eventually, in some kind of justice for the people he hurt. And for you. He looked at the coffee, the table, at the window where the main street of Silver Creek was doing what it did on a Saturday, ordinary and continuous and completely itself. And the way a place is when it's been a place for a long time and intends to keep being one. This, he said. Angie, all of this, he gestured at the diner, at the street, at the space where his farm was, 12 miles outside of town. And with its one burned field and its one whole field, and its property full of people who had ridden through the night because he had spent 14 years being worth riding through the night for. And this is what comes after for me. Megan looked at him. And that's enough, she said. Yeah, he said. It's more than enough. The agreement Blake signed on Saturday was the beginning of a process, and not the end of one. And the first thing that process required was patience, which was, as it happened, the one resource Ethan Walker had in genuine abundance. And Grace stayed in Silver Creek for 3 more weeks after that Saturday. She set up a working space at the kitchen table, Ruth's table. And she had now hosted more significant conversations in a single month than in the previous decade combined. And she worked through the documentation with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood that the difference between a preliminary agreement and actual accountability was the distance between a promise and its proof. And Hargrove, true to the door he had stepped through at the diner, and produced records within 10 days that none of them had expected to see without a court order. Count transfers, internal communications, paper trail of instructions that went from Blake's office to the people who carried them out with a directness that made Grace sit very still at the table for a long moment before she said anything. He put it in writing, and she said to no one in particular. To some of it. Not all, but enough. Ethan was across the table from her. Ange, what does that mean? It means the civil case just became significantly stronger than I thought it was. She looked up. It also means the DA's office is going to be very interested in what Hargrove has given us. Is that your call? Sandra Park's call, partly. Once her story runs, and the DA can't ignore it, and Grace tapped her pen on the notepad. What Hargrove brought us, it goes beyond tortious interference and property damage. And There are payments here to the mechanic who filed the false report on Trowbridge's truck. And there's an internal memo about the Sheridan and Wyoming acquisition that she stopped. And she set the pen down. And the man who died, witnessing the heart attack. Ethan looked at her. And I can't say it was murder. Indeed, the evidence doesn't reach that. But there are communications in here about escalating pressure on that acquisition that are going to require a very serious conversation with investigators who have more authority than I do. And she held his gaze. I need you to understand what this might become. Indices, tell me, it might become a criminal investigation. See, multiple counts in multiple jurisdictions. It might take years. It will certainly take longer than you want it to take. And there will be periods where it feels like nothing is moving. And there will be moments where Blake's lawyers find something that slows everything down. And she paused. And Blake might still, and ultimately, intend to settle the criminal exposure the same way he settled us with money and cooperation, in a way that keeps him out of a cell. Again, she watched his face. And that happens. I won't pretend it doesn't. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Indeed, what happened to the family in Sheridan? And Grace opened a separate folder. And wife's name is Diane Kowalski. And Guy, 54 years old. And she has 2 adult children. And the farm sold 8 months after her husband died. She couldn't work it alone and couldn't afford to hire help. And she's living with her daughter in Cheyenne. A pause. And she doesn't know that his death may not have been entirely natural. And the kitchen was completely quiet. Outside, the late August morning was doing what late August mornings in Montana do, and which be so unreasonably beautiful that it almost hurts. Ethan sat with this specific piece of information, Diane Kowalski, 54, and living with her daughter in Cheyenne, because the farm she and her husband spent their lives building was now a line item in a development portfolio, and let it settle into its proper place, and was somewhere alongside Trowbridge's limp and Dale's cousin, and the 43 acres of black stubble that were investing 3 weeks later, and beginning to show the first thin suggestions of green at their edges. And does she know? He asked. About the investigation. No. And not yet. And she needs to know. And he said simply, and without drama, as a fact. Before the story runs, anything before anything becomes public. He needs to sit down with her and tell her what we found and what it means, and that her husband's death is going to be looked at again. Looked at Grace. Can you do that? And Grace looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said. And I can do that. He nodded. Thank you. And she drove to Cheyenne 4 days later. Andra Park's story ran in the Gazette on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the diner. It ran at the top of the digital front page with a headline that was careful and precise, not inflammatory, and just accurate, which in this case was more than sufficient. And the headline was, Resort Developers 8-Year Acquisition Pattern Prompts Criminal Investigation Review. And the story was 4,000 words, and it named names and cited documents and quoted Trowbridge by name, with his permission, and quoted Dale with his permission, and quoted a county clerk named Russell, who said on the record that he had noticed anomalies in Blake's filings for 2 years and had not known who to bring them to. And the story did not quote Ethan by name in the first version that had been his choice, and Sandra had respected it, attributing the initial complaint to a Silver Creek landowner whose property was damaged in what investigators describe as a deliberate arson. A noon, the wire services had picked it up. And by 3 in the afternoon, in Blake's company stock, he had taken Cascade Development public 2 years earlier, and against, which turned out to be a decision with consequences he had not fully thought through, had dropped 11%. Indy 5, Blake's personal attorney, and separate from Hargrove, had issued a statement describing the story as selectively sourced and factually incomplete, which was the kind of statement that means nothing and changes nothing but has to be made for the record. Ethan heard about all of this from Megan, who was tracking it on her phone from behind the counter and sending him texts with the specific enthusiasm of a woman who has been waiting for something like this for a very long time. Her text had an energy he hadn't seen from her before. And the third one just said 11% in capitals. Angie, with a period. He read it at the kitchen table and put his phone face down and went back outside. The south field was his focus now. Not what had burned that was gone for this season, and that was a fact, and there was no point circling it but the preparation for what came next. And soil needed work before fall. He had seeds sourced, and finally, through a supplier, 2 states over who had no relationship with Blake's network and who had asked no questions and charged a fair price. He had equipment functioning. He had Bears people, Indigo, the ones who stayed, and who by this point fixed not just the east fence, but 3 other sections he'd been deferring for years, and repaired the secondary outbuilding roof, and he replaced the water pump on the north irrigation line, and accomplished, collectively, more maintenance work in 3 weeks than Ethan had managed in the previous 2 years. He had protested this, and Bear had told him, with the patience of a man who had been telling Ethan things for 35 years, and to stop talking and let people do things for him. And you spent 14 years doing things for other people, Bear had said. And then you spent 35 years being too stubborn to let anyone return it. And you're 72. Some point, you have to let people give back. You don't need. If Ethan, Bear had looked at him with the specific look he used for conversations that were going to end only one way, regardless of how long they took. And shut up and let the kid fix your roof. Ethan had shut up and let the kid fix the roof. Into Hargrove's cooperation with the investigation became official in the 4th week, and it changed everything about the legal timeline in ways that Grace had hoped for, but not counted on. And Hargrove wasn't just providing documents. He was providing context, the internal logic of how Blake's operation had been structured, and the chain of decisions that connected the office in Billings to the men with gas cans in a Montana wheat field at 2 in the morning. He was doing it, Grace explained to Ethan, because his own exposure had become significant enough that full cooperation was genuinely his best option, and because 9 years of facilitating this work had apparently, and finally, accumulated into something that his own internal accounting found unsustainable. He told me something, and Grace said, on one of her last evenings at the kitchen table before she drove back to Tucson. Half the record. Engido, tell me. He said he went home after the first meeting with Blake, not the Saturday diner. In the initial meeting when Blake hired him, 9 years ago, and his wife asked how it went. He described the work and what the client did, and how the acquisitions functioned. Indeed, she paused. Indeed, she asked him one question. And she said, "Are the people on the other side of these deals okay?" And he told her yes, and they're fine. It's just business, and they're better off in the long run. He told me he has thought about that conversation almost every day for 9 years. Ethan was quiet for a moment. His wife sounds like a smart woman. He said the same thing. And Grace closed the file she had in front of her. I want to be clear about something before I leave. This case is going to move forward. The criminal review is real. The DA in Billings has opened a formal inquiry, and the Wyoming AG's office is in communication with them about the Sheridan situation. Blake is going to be dealing with this for a very long time. The civil settlement's yours, and Trowbridge's, and potentially others are going to be funded because Hargrove has given us a roadmap to assets that Blake cannot hide or move fast enough. He looked at him. What I can't promise is that it all lands exactly where justice would put it. And the system is what it is. But the truth is out now, and that doesn't go back in. No, Ethan said. Are you okay with that? And the uncertainty about the endpoint. He thought about the field outside, and about the seeds he'd ordered, about fall planting, and the specific hope that is a farmer's baseline condition, the act of putting something in the ground that won't come back for months. It's based on nothing but the accumulated experience that the ground, engine, given what it needs, and keeps its end of the arrangement. And I've been farming for 40 years, he said. You know how to work towards something I can't see yet. And Grace smiled, a real one, and the first fully unguarded one he had seen from her. And I'll be in touch, she said. Indeed, probably more often than you'd like. Probably less often than you should be, he said. And drive safe. The day Bear left was the last week of August, and it came the same way. Everything significant came in Ethan's life, and she, without announcement, and just the weight of it arriving and making itself known. Most of the others had already gone in small groups over the preceding weeks, and had gone back to their lives and roads and the ordinary business of being who they were. And they left the way they'd arrived, without ceremony, and with a completeness to it that didn't need words. A handshake, indeed sometimes a hand on the shoulder. In the specific economy of communication between people who trust each other enough not to over-explain anything. Indy Bear was the last. He loaded his bike Tuesday morning while Ethan stood in the yard drinking coffee, and they did not make a production of it. You'll call if something comes up, and this Bear said. And nothing's going to come up. Ends. That's not what I said. Ethan looked at him. And go, I'll call. Bear secured the last of his gear and stood with his hands on his hips and looked at the farm, the repaired fences, and the functioning outbuilding, in the north field that was green and right, in the south field that was black at its center and green at its edges, and that was, in its slow and stubborn way, in doing what burned land does when you leave it alone and give it time. And you built something here, and Bear said. And Ruth and I built something here. And she'd be pleased, and Bear said. Hinges in with how this went. She'd be pleased, and she'd have 17 specific opinions about things I did wrong along the way. Yeah, probably. Anytime. Bear looked at him. Ain, I'm glad you called. Almost didn't. No, Bear swung onto his bike. And don't wait another 35 years. And you'll be dead in 35 years. Probably, Bear said. Intigo, call anyway. He started the engine. And she looked at Ethan one more time. And something passed in them, in that look that had the weight of two lives that had run alongside each other for 40 years, parallel in some stretches, and divergent in others, in pine, but connected by a thread that neither of them had ever quite been willing to cut entirely. Take care of the land, brother. Care of the road, Ethan said. Near rode down the drive and turned onto the county road, and the sound of the engine moved away through the morning air and then was gone. And the farm was quiet in the specific way it is quiet, after a large presence has left it not empty, Inswan, but resettled and rearranged around its original shape. Ethan stood in the yard for a while. He finished his coffee and then went to work. Andrew Park's second story ran 6 weeks after the first, and this one named Ethan. It was his decision and arrived at slowly and for reasons he had taken his time understanding. And Sandra had asked, again, after the first story ran and the investigation was public. He had said he needed to think. And she had waited with a patience that told him she understood. The question was not a simple one, and the reasons for saying no were real. And he had spent 35 years building a life that did not announce its history, and there was something in him that wanted to protect that, not from shame, but from the specific invasion that comes when a private life becomes a public story. He did not want to be a story. He had never wanted to be a story. He wanted to plant things and watch them grow and be a decent neighbor and keep a promise he made at a kitchen table to a woman who deserved every year of the peace he had built for her. And the reason for saying yes was also real, and it was this. To began. Kevin, who had driven one of the trucks and who had told his story on the porch with his hat turning in his hands because he couldn't finish a sentence about his work to his 14-year-old daughter. And Trowbridge, who was going to get his money, but would carry the limp forever. And Diane Kowalski in Cheyenne, and who had learned from Grace, a quiet room, that the investigation into what happened to her husband was being reopened, and who had sat with that information for a long time and then said, and very softly, and she had always wondered, and that she had always known something was wrong, but had had no way to know what or how or who to ask. And those people had names now, and their situations had names. And the full picture had become visible because enough people had decided to be counted. He called Sandra and said yes. The second story ran on a Thursday as well. The headline was, "In Farmer, They Didn't Know." In the subheading said, "And how a retired Hells Angels member's refusal to sell his land unraveled 8 years of systemic developer fraud." He read it at the kitchen table with his morning coffee. He read it once through carefully and then set his phone face down and looked out the window at the south field, which was not black anymore. In its center, it was still thin. The new growth there was pale and tentative. Not yet the dense winter wheat green it would be by spring, but it was there. You could see it clearly if you walked out and looked. A month ago, it had been nothing but char. And now, it was the beginning of something. And his phone started ringing at 8:30 and did not stop until he turned it off at noon. And the calls were from numbers he didn't recognize journalists. He assumed any other outlets picking up the story. He didn't answer them. Said what he wanted to say to Sandra, and it was in the story, and anyone who wanted his perspective could read it. Was not interested in becoming a figure. Was interested in finishing the fall preparation in the south field before the window closed. He did answer one call. "Megan, at 10. "Have you seen it?" she said. "And I read it this morning. It's everywhere. Been shared, I can't even count. People from places I've never heard of are sharing it." And she sounded slightly overwhelmed, which was not her baseline condition. And there are comments, hundreds of comments. People saying, she stopped. Ambly, people are moved by it. And really, moved. And then sure story. And what you did. What Ruth meant to you. And the promise you kept. It was quiet for a moment. "And are you okay?" "Amy," she asked. He looked at the window, the field, at the thin green pushing up through the black where 6 weeks ago there had been nothing. Yeah, he said. And she's okay. And people want to know if you're going to sell now. Now that now that everything is going the way it's going. Ache. Financially, you could. No, he said. You didn't even let me finish. I know what you were going to ask. A pause. And you're going to plant again. I'm going to plant again. She laughed that same surprised, and he genuine laugh from the kitchen weeks ago. And of course you are, a beat. Ethan. For what it's worth, for whatever it's worth, I think Ruth would be really proud of you. He put his hand flat on the table. Meaning the same table. And the same wood. And same window. He hopes so, he said. I really do. And the fall planting went in on a Tuesday in late September, which was the right week for the Silver Creek Valley given the frost patterns. And Ethan did it himself, into the way he had always done it, in the repaired cedar, running behind the tractor that he had fixed with his own hands, and a part sourced from a man 3 counties over who had asked no questions. Planted the full south field, and all 43 acres. Did it from first light until the late afternoon when the low September sun told him to stop. And when he was done, he climbed down from the tractor and stood at the edge of the field and looked at what he had put in the ground and felt the specific feeling that never got ordinary, no matter how many times he experienced it, the feeling of having done the one irreducible act of faith that farming requires, which is to put a living thing into the dark and trust the ground. Stood there for a while, and not thinking about Blake, whose lawyers were in active negotiation with the DA's office, and who would. And Grace had told him that week, and it almost certainly be entering a plea arrangement before the end of the year. Any thinking about the civil settlements, which were proceeding on the timeline Grace had projected, and which would eventually, collectively, amount to a reckoning that was financial and public and permanent. And thinking about the story, which was still circulating online, and had generated a phone call from a documentary filmmaker that he had let go to voicemail and had not called back. Not thinking about any of it. And to think about the field, and about the seeds under the soil, and about December and January and the weight that was coming, and the trust that was required. And he pulled out his phone. He had one unread message he'd started keeping his phone on and checking it since the story ran, in which was an adjustment he was still making. The message was from a number he didn't recognize, in the Montana area code. It said, Mr. Walker, my name is Diane Kowalski, and I got your number from Grace Mitchell. I hope that's okay. He just wanted to say thank you. I haven't been able to say it to anyone's specific until now. And thank you for being the person who didn't look away. And my husband was a good man. He deserved better than what happened to him. And so did you. And I'm glad somebody finally stood up. In the end, Diane. Ethan read it twice. He looked at the field. He thought about a woman in Cheyenne and a husband who didn't come home from a drive on a road he'd driven 600 times, and a farm that was now somebody else's resort corridor, and the 14-year-old that had become a woman grown, and the ordinary, irreplaceable weight of a life interrupted. Type back, Mrs. Indice Kowalski. Thank you for writing. Your husband deserved better. And I'm sorry it took this long. Indrid, what's being done now won't give you back what you lost. and seen, but it's something. I hope it matters. Ethan Walker put the phone in his pocket and walked back to the house. The first green came up in the south field in early November. Ethan saw it on a Wednesday morning. When he walked the field at dawn, the way he walked it every morning, the same route and the same pace, the same attention to the ground that 40 years had made not a habit, but a practice. And the way prayer is a practice for some people. And the daily act of showing up and paying attention and being present to what the land is doing. He saw the green in the center section first, the part that had burned hottest, the part he had worried about most, and he stopped and crouched down and looked at it with his hands on his knees in the cold November air, doing what November air does in Montana, which is make everything absolutely clear. It was thin. It was pale. It was, by any objective measure, not impressive. A person who didn't know would have looked at it and seen almost nothing. Ethan looked at it and saw everything. He put his hand on the ground beside the new growth, not touching it, and just near it, in the way you put your hand near something you want to feel the warmth of without disturbing. Stayed like that for a while. And the sun was still low, and the field was long and empty, and his breath was visible, and the only sound was the specific silence of a Montana morning that has decided to be fully itself. He thought about the night of the fire. The 2 a.m. orange glow. And the men standing by their trucks, watching it like entertainment. In 9 words he had said, and the laugh that had answered them, and the drive away in the dark that those men had made. Absolutely certain they were leaving behind a problem solved. He thought about what they had actually left behind. A field that was burned but not dead. A man who was quiet but not weak. A network of people who were distant but not gone. A promise that had not broken. A table a woman he loved had sat for 19 years, and where the most important conversations of the last 2 months of his life had happened, as if the table itself was holding something she had put there. Stood up. He looked at the field from his full height, the pale November light on the thin green rows, and the black soil between them, still rich and dark, and doing what it had always done, inning, which was exactly what you needed it to do if you gave it what it needed and had the patience to wait. He thought about what Megan had said when he told her the first green was coming in. And she'd said, and see, what does it feel like? Indigo, he thought about it for a moment. And he said, and like proof. And of what? In that it was worth staying. And she had been quiet for a second. And then she'd said, yeah, it was. He walked out of the field and back toward the house. And the morning opened up around him the way Montana mornings do, wide and cold and specific and entirely indifferent to human drama, entered one thing, which was one of the things he had always loved most about it. And the land didn't care about Connor Blake. And the land didn't care about the story or the investigation or the settlements or any of it. Indian. The land cared about what was in it and whether you were paying attention and whether you'd be back tomorrow to do what needed doing. He would be back tomorrow. He would be back the day after that. And had seeds in the ground and a fence that was mended and a pump that was working and a table in his kitchen where good people had sat and done important things and a name that a woman in Cheyenne had thanked him for and a promise he had kept to the person who mattered most. And 43 acres of winter wheat coming back from the black, slowly, into stubbornly, in 10. The way things come back when they were never actually destroyed, maybe only interrupted. He had burned his field. And they had shut down his suppliers and damaged his tractor and sent a man to sit in a diner and listen and filed false complaints, and done everything that 20 years of successful intimidation had taught them to do to a man they had assessed as entirely alone. And what they had found, under all of it, was not what they expected. Not a man who broke, not a man who begged, and not a man whose quietness was absence. What they found was a man whose quietness was depth, and whose stillness was not resignation but roots, who had spent 35 years putting things in the ground and watching them grow and keeping a promise and building, acre by acre, and season by season, and neighbor by neighbor, in something that could not be bought or burned, a life so thoroughly rooted in this particular piece of earth and these particular people that setting fire to 43 acres of it was not destruction but revelation. Burning away the surface to show what was underneath. And what was underneath was everything. Ethan Walker went inside. He made coffee. He sat at the table, and he put his hands on the wood. And he looked out the window at his field, every acre of it, and the burned and the whole, the recovering and the already strong, and the seeds in the ground, and the green above, and the long Montana winter, and that would test all of it, and that the field would come through. Because that was what this field did. What it had always done. It would keep doing long after Ethan Walker was gone. And he drank his coffee. Outside, the winter wheat was growing. And the legend had never been the vest, or the road, the 40 men who rode through the night in answer to a single call. And the legend was this: a man who chose love over reputation, and peace over power, and roots over road, and who, in everything he had built, was threatened, and then proved without raising his voice or lifting a hand that the deepest strength a person can carry is not what they're capable of doing to others, but what they have built that is worth defending, and who stands beside them when it matters, and why. And that was Ethan Walker. That was always who he was. And the field grew, and the fence held, and the land kept every promise he had made to it, because that is what land does for the people who truly belong to it.